Everyone, welcome to the April 8th meeting of the Salina City Commission. I'd like to call the meeting to order and have the clerk call the roll.
Mayor Jennings.
Here.
Commissioner Angel. Here. Commissioner Crawford.
Here.
Commissioner Householder.
Here.
Commissioner Shirley.
Here.
Would those that are able please rise, join me in the Pledge of Allegiance in a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Start our meeting with the citizens forum. If any citizens have an issue or an item to bring before the commission that's not a published part of today's agenda, we ask that you come forward, state your name and address.
Good evening, City Commissioner and Mr. Mayor. Is there any initiative within the city to investigate the extent of human trafficking? And are there any efforts to reduce that traffic in the city of Salina?
I'm going to ask you to, just for the folks at home, give us your name and address.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
that's all right.
Tracy Sin, 340.5 South Connecticut, Salina, Kansas.
I think you're asking wonderful questions, and I would probably just direct you either to the city manager's office when we're looking for, because you're specifically asking for policies and ordinance action, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I would direct you to the city manager's office to investigate, and then I'd encourage that to be shared, whatever extent you want to share it.
Because there's a lot of this human trafficking going on I-70.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I want them to be aware of that. And if they have any question about it, call Dorothy Haley. She's the general attorney. She's also a community educator of human sex slavery trafficking, 785-296-2215. Or call the governor, Sam Brownback himself.
Excellent. Thank you. Have anybody else that would like to come before the commission? Okay, seeing none, we move into awards and proclamations.
Item 4.1, the day of April 9, 2013 as National Service Recognition Day in the City of Salina. Maribel Panuco, AmeriCorps coordinator with Catholic Charities of Northern Kansas, will read the proclamation.
Good afternoon.
I'm Karen Hauser from Catholic Charities, and Maribel is ill today, so I'll be taking her place. Whereas service to others is a hallmark of the American character and central to how we meet our challenges, and whereas AmeriCorps and Senior Corps address the most pressing challenges facing our cities and nation, educating students for future success, supporting veterans and military families, preserving the environment, and helping communities recover from national disasters. And whereas national service expands economic opportunity by creating more sustainable, resilient communities and providing education, career skills, and leadership abilities for those who serve. And whereas national service participants serve in more than 70,000 locations across the country, including Salina, bolstering the civic, neighborhood, and faith-based organizations that are so vital to our economic and social well-being. And whereas national service participants increase the impact of the organizations they serve, both through their direct service and by recruiting and managing additional volunteers. And whereas national service represents a unique public-private partnership that invests in community solutions and leverages non-federal resources to strengthen community impact and increase the return on taxpayer dollars. And whereas local AmeriCorps members and Senior Corps volunteers serving through the foster grandparent and RSVP programs demonstrate commitment, dedication, and patriotism by making an intensive commitment to service in our community. And whereas the Corporation of National and Community Service shares a priority with mayors nationwide to engage citizens, improve lives, and strengthen communities, it is joining with mayors across the country to support the Mayor's Day of Recognition for National Service on April 9th, 2013. Now, therefore, I, Norman Jennings, Mayor, hereby proclaim April 9, 2013 as National Service Recognition Day in Salina, Kansas, and encourage residents to recognize the positive impact of national service in our city, to thank those who serve, and to find ways that they also can give back to their community. Signed this 8th day of April 2013 by Mayor Norman Jennings.
Excellent. Do you have any activities that are going on that you'd like to bring our attention to?
Yes. The Foster Grandparent Program, which is sponsored by the North Central Flint Hills Area Agency on Aging, is holding a volunteer recognition event in Saline and Dickinson County foster grandparents on Tuesday, April 16th. And RSVP volunteers will be involved in the Spring Spruce Up of Salina on April 20th and will be honored at special activities during May, which is Older Americans Month. The RSVP program is part of the Volunteer Connection and is sponsored locally by the Kansas Wesleyan University. And I will also mention that National AmeriCorps Week was the week of March 10th, in which we had our AmeriCorps members from Catholic Charities doing community service at the Sunflower Adult Day Center, the Salina Rescue Mission, and Ashby House.
Excellent. Well, I'd personally like to thank you for all of the volunteer hours and efforts, and for bringing this proclamation forward to us. I do have 3 signed copies of it here if you'd like to come forward, and I give them to you at this time.
Item 4.2, the week of April 15th through the 19th, 2013, as National Work Zone Awareness Week in the City of Salina. David Cohart, Construction Coordinator with the Public Works Department, will read the proclamation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Whereas construction work and repairs to our roads must be done with traffic on them, putting both motorists and workers at risk every day, and whereas workers diligently continue to improve, rebuild, and maintain roadways so motorists can safely and efficiently travel through Salina, and whereas in Kansas during 2012, 15 people were killed and 606 people were injured in work zone related crashes, and whereas nearly 90% of the people injured or killed in work zone crashes each year are motorists, making work zone safety important to all citizens. And whereas many of these facilities and injuries were caused by inattentive driving, driving too closely, and speeding in construction zones. And whereas to reduce fatalities and injuries, motorists must remember to set aside distractions, be extra cautious, and give work zones their undivided attention when traveling. And whereas safety on the roads is a shared responsibility, and we must all do our part to keep our roadways safe. And whereas the City of Salina is dedicated to enhancing work zone safety for both road workers and motorists. Now, therefore, I, Norman M. Jennings, Mayor of the City of Salina, do hereby proclaim the week of April 15th through April 19th, 2013 as National Work Zone Awareness Week in the City of Salina, and I call upon all citizens and civic organizations to acquaint themselves with the issues involved in work zone safety and to recognize the contributions which public works officials make every day to our health, safety, comfort, and quality of life while working under these adverse conditions. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the City of Salina, Kansas, to be affixed this 8th day of April 2013. Norman Jennings, Mayor.
Excellent. Do you have any activities planned you'd like to let us know about?
Public Works staff will be wearing orange ribbons on their clothing for this week.
Okay, excellent. I have a signed copy of the proclamation here for you. Today, we do not have any public hearings or items scheduled for a certain time, so that moves us to the consent agenda.
Item 6.1, approve the minutes of April 1, 2013. Item 6.2, resolution number 13-6996, appointing Mike Flory to the Building Advisory Board. Item 6.3, authorize the purchase of 13 traffic signal battery backup systems from Gady Sales in the amount of $49,100. Item 6.4, award of contract for the 2013 street markings, project number 13-2959 to Highway Signing Incorporated in the amount of $20,001.52.
Any items the Commissioner has a question on or wishes pulled from the consent agenda? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion.
I move we approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? That motion carried 5-0. We now move on to development business.
Item 7.1, application number SP 13-1, requesting approval of a special event permit to allow the placement of a wireless communication facility in a PDD R1 district. The subject property is the Kenwood Cove Aquatic Center located in the Kenwood Park Addition, which is addressed as 701 West Kenwood Park Drive. 7.1A, resolution number 13-6994.
Mr. Andrew.
Mayor, Commissioners, the location we're talking about is an area that is located just directly to the north of the Kenwood Cove Aquatic Center, between there and a parking lot that serves the Bicentennial Center. And Nextech, a cellular service provider, has been working to establish and develop a cellular service network in Salina over the past year. They have co-located antennas at South High, at the tower there, at the East Crawford Recreation Area Tower. They've located antennas on the United Building and the Marymount Administration Building. They've constructed towers on Franklin Street and on the south side of Magnolia Road, west of I-135 in Saline County. And they have opened a retail store on South 9th Street. They have identified a gap in their service coverage in the east central part of Salina, the area roughly in the vicinity of the Crawford and Ohio intersection, and they have been exploring options in the vicinity of the Bicentennial Center. And the Oakdale Park, YMCA, the Kenwood Park area, when we have large groupings of people over there, that's one of the highest traffic volume areas for cellular service in the city. And the stage that we're at now in the industry is it's more about capacity than coverage. Early on, they're building their networks. It was important to get towers spaced so that there were no dead spots or lack of coverage. But now, as the appetite for cellular service, for texting and other forms of communication, there's a need for additional capacity or the systems get overloaded. So what they're proposing at this location is a special permit to allow construction of a 150-foot monopole tower north of the Kenwood Cove lap pool, and this would serve as an antenna support for Nextech and other future carriers. The monopole tower would be designed as a stealth tower, meaning all the antennas would be located inside the poles and would be designed to support up to 5 carriers. So Dustin has up on the screen here, these are flag poles, but this is an example of what we mean by a stealth pole. A typical tower like you might see at the Salina Stadium or at South High, you'd have a monopole tower with exterior antennas attached to it. This design would be designed in such a way that the antenna array would be inside the cylinder of the pole, and regardless of whether there was 1 or ultimately 5 carriers, instead of seeing the exterior antennas, they would be inside the pole. Also, as part of this proposal, a 60-foot by 80-foot fenced-in equipment area for equipment shelters would be located at the base of the tower, and that would be surrounded by vegetative screening and landscaping. At this time, there is no proposal to use the tower for other uses, such as a flagpole or to support lights. It is strictly for the purpose of cellular service, but would have no exterior antennas. We've outlined for you the zoning history and the ownership history of Kenwood Park, which I'm sure you are familiar with, and the process we are under here is we have determined this as a Class C permit request, and so you as a City Commission may approve a special permit for this tower following a public hearing and recommendation by the Planning Commission. And that hearing was held on the 19th of March, and they reviewed this proposal and made several findings and recommended some conditions. But one of the things they looked at and had questions about was the proximity to the north side of the Kenwood Cove Aquatic Center and whether that would hinder possible future expansion of that. Upon hearing from representatives of the Parks and Recreation Department that it would not, they made a finding that you see there, number one, that recreation areas are identified as preferred locations for new tower sites, and that this location will not impact the ability of the Kenwood Cove Aquatic Center to expand its facilities in the future. They found that the location, the tower design, which this is a view from Kenwood Park Drive. You can see that the Bicentennial Center is off just to the side, but there are existing light poles in the vicinity, both of which are over 100 feet in height. And so they felt that if this was bronze and not white, as shown in this picture, that it would be compatible with the surroundings, which is all public facilities. They found that the color and finish of the tower, being bronze, would be compatible with the other light poles in the vicinity. They noted that there was a landscape buffer around the equipment shelters and equipment that would screen those items from public view, that the would not be out of scale with either the Bicentennial Center or the existing light poles, and they found that Kenwood Park is not a gateway or entryway into the city, and there would not be any impact on any historical resources. In their action, the Planning Commission had 6 recommended conditions. Some of these are pretty standard, that obviously that it be a stealth design monopole, that it be no taller than 150 feet in height and bronze in color, that there would be wrought iron fencing around the fenced-in equipment area, that buildings located inside that area should not exceed 12 feet in height, that there be surfacing inside the fenced-in area to allow for vehicle access and discourage weed growth inside the fenced-in area, that there would be a detailed planning plan that would be reviewed by planning and Parks Recreation staff before there was a permit issued for the tower, and obviously that there be a ground lease executed between Nextech Wireless and the City of Salina before a permit for construction of the tower. We've identified several alternatives for you there, which would be to concur with the action of the Planning Commission. You could request that the applicant modify their proposal either by reducing the height of the pole or changing its location or reducing the size of the fenced-in equipment area or relocating that area. You could return this item to the Planning Commission to have them provide enhanced findings as to their reasons for recommending approval, or you could overturn their recommendation and deny the request if you don't believe this is a suitable site for a monopole tower. What we have attached for you is a resolution, and that resolution contains a summary of the Planning Commission's findings and conclusions in written form. You may approve that resolution as drafted, or if there are items that you are not in agreement with, because this is a quasi-judicial matter, you could recess into closed session with the city attorney and develop alternative findings if you do not concur with those that are included in the resolution. We have Richard Gato with Next Tech and J.C. Sadler with Elite Wireless here. We also have Mr. Louthan from Parks and Recreation if you have any questions related to Kenwood Cove. I'd be happy to address any questions or go back to any graphics if you'd like to see them in more detail.
Any immediate questions for staff?
Thank you.
Do we have public comment or others that would like to address the commission on this? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission. I respect the opinion of the Parks and Rec Department. I do, but I think this is an absolutely short-sighted location for this. I think it takes away all of our future expansion in that area. As a matter of fact, that's exactly where we were laying out the sprinkler park a long time ago when there was going to be possibly a separate sprinkler park there. There was talk of a different, longer pool that wasn't a part of it, and that would be the area that it would go with the pump houses. And it just seems to be that it would take away the only sizable green area right there that we could do anything significant. And I don't know in the design phase of this why it wouldn't fit in on the south side of that sidewalk in that triangular area, which wouldn't be much of a useful space in the future, or whether that's used for other things. But I just don't think that it's a good location in the proximity of the parking lot between the park on that side of the sidewalk. And then the only other thing that I would have is if something were to occur there down the road on a modified plan, I saw the the fencing called out, and I would just want to make sure that the ornamental fencing that would be used around it was an exact match for what the Parks and Rec did around the aquatics park. So it wasn't something that was kind of close but had different tops, but it just looked an exact match no matter where it was put. So are there any other thoughts or comments or
Just
questions?
my thoughts would kind of echo what you're saying. I was a little concerned about the location. I knew that you had been interested in, back when the pool, before I was on the commission, at the, what do you call it, 80 meter or 100, I don't know, swimming.
Bigger one.
A big pool,
Yeah.
yeah. And we had also discussed maybe making that the free water park area, and that's my only concern. I just didn't know if there were any other areas around here that would adequate. I mean, I'm happy to work with them. I think the plan looks great, and I mean, I'm a cell phone user like nobody's business, so anytime we can add a tower is great. And I'd be happy to look at other locations. I just share your concerns with our expansion there, and if there's no other areas we can go, then, you know, maybe that's what we've got to do. But I'd sure be interested in trying to see if we can, you know, shoehorn this thing in someplace else to protect that little space there. Maybe the cell guys can let us know if they've looked at some other things, or Parks and Rec or something can let us know if they've looked at other areas that maybe it won't work in, or
Yeah, I
if there's
think-
any other areas around the building, or.
Yeah, I think we can go there. If somebody has some comment, I think that if we send it away for this location and keep it open is one of the options that Mr. Andrew proposed, then we would then as well hear back that there's just absolutely no other place that it could be put. If there's enough discomfort today with just saying that's the right area for it. We don't have alternate proposals that we could hear on. I think it would just be more of a matter of we either like it as presented right there, or we're going to not want one there ever, or we want to send it back and have something worked out that meets the needs.
Well, I think it's worth a discussion maybe with them, at least to see if there's, you know, we still haven't come up with a use for the other side where the other pool is, if there's some land over there, or, you know, and again, I don't know anything about locating towers, the science of it all. I'd really love to hear maybe from the Next Tech people, and they can tell us that, hey, here's the reason we have to be here, and at least hear a good argument of why it would need to occupy this space.
Sir?
Oh, great.
Excuse me. My name is Richard Gato. I'm from Next Tech Wireless in Hays, Kansas. Thank you for your time and opportunity to address your questions. As far as this location, I will tell you we did look at to the north, and I know there were some issues with a possible hotel there, so that was ruled out. So we were directed by the cities, and I believe they're the Bicentennial Management Company, to look at this site. Nextech Wireless absolutely wants to work with the city, and what we are trying to do is fill a void in coverage area, but yet still work within the city's requirements of co-location and provide some opportunities for additional carriers in the future to be able to meet their data needs and address the city requirements. As far as this exact location, it's not 100%. I mean, if we were across the street, and I'm using that hypothetically, it would not matter as far as single coverage and transmission coverage. We would prefer this area for the reasons that Mr. Andrews addressed, because of the usage in this area has increased dramatically. I see where the Bicentennial Center is looking at a record attendance this year. Those are all things that affect data service and usage, especially when they're high volume events. And what happens, without getting into great details, is we allow on our signal, we have 58 agreements with other carriers, so that if they get busy on their towers and they can't pass through a signal, it would come to our tower.
Rollover.
So this tower, it's with the volume increase in data traffic and signal traffic in Salina, and in this site area in particular, a location in this area is critical for us.
How far around that area, just so I can get kind of a visual idea, and I'm sure you guys have looked at it, but maybe, how far out away from there can you go? I mean, are we talking a quarter of a mile and still have the same thing, or does it need to be within 400 yards? Or
it doesn't. A quarter of a mile in that location is not critical.
difficult.
The biggest thing to remember is we have to address power to the site.
Sure.
And telco, to telephone, fiber to the site. The good thing is with the Bicentennial Center, that is all there as currently. So it's a good fit in that aspect. We would increase additional cost if we were to move it, but we're willing to definitely, if that's what it takes to get this approved, we would be willing to work with the city to see
Sure.
that met.
It's nice to hear. They usually tell us, if it's not here, we just can't do it. That's normally what we hear. It's
Well-
got to be this, or we can't do it. So I appreciate your willingness to look around. Have we, with this master plan of this hotel and all that, I mean, my feelings on that have always been that that's a long-term project, and I don't know how viable it is. I mean, it would be nice. Are there thoughts that if the tower was built over there and then a hotel was built, what is the cost to replace it and put it up on the roof of this hotel? Or, I mean, again, I'm asking completely questions of my complete ignorance to the subject of this. So
The problem with the hotel is it's not built,
right,
and we need something, frankly, now.
right, and that's my thought is if we build over there and they do build a hotel, what is the cost of moving the tower back, integrating it with the hotel? If they would, I don't know. I'm just throwing out random ideas
Well,
here.
If we were to put a stealth tower there, and then to decommission it,
Pretty expensive.
yeah.
You don't have to give me numbers. I'll believe you. I
A
can
stealth
imagine.
tower, to give you an idea, a stealth tower just about doubles the cost
Of a regular
of a regular tower.
tower.
And a regular tower's $100,000 plus just
So-
for the tower.
Is there a possibility that goes up, are they so heavy that they can't be installed on top of roofs?
No, they can be installed on top of roofs, but again, the Bicentennial Center, for example, itself is not high enough in that area because the Bicentennial Center is in a low-lying area. And that's one of the reasons we kind of waited until the Indian Rock proposal was presented to this group, commission, and saw how it went, because that would have been a little far out for us, but we understand how the city works and their desires, so we kind of waited for that, and when we saw that did not pass, we came forward with this proposal.
And that was my thought, if we're getting ready to do all the work on the Bicentennial Center and work on the roof loading, can we work it out such that the
Put one on
tower
top,
can go
little
on
center
top of
tower,
there,
little
too?
pier.
Yeah, I want to clarify, because I think you're thinking of antennas on the roof, not a tower structure. Is that correct?
Yes,
Just an
when you say
antenna.
antennas on the roof,
Right.
Yeah.
I'm thinking adding antennas to the roof.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
A tower structure, I mean, we did look at closer property to the Bicentennial Center, and it
Can't get it up
created
high
a
enough.
number of headaches because of the size of the space we need. The other thing you got to remember, it's not just one carrier. This is a 5-carrier pole, because we are trying to work with the city and meet those co-location requirements. This is a 5-carrier pole, so therefore the compound area has to be larger than a traditional cell tower, where we would just put maybe 1 or 2 carriers. So it's kind of the devil's advocate, if you will. You
Sure,
know,
no, it's
you want the co-location, but we had to have the space to make that work.
I think it's probably worth noting as well that the tower is 150 feet tall compared to the buildings. We're talking
Right.
3 to 5 times as tall as what you might think of for a typical structure.
Yeah, I mean, the Bicentennial Center, I believe, is equivalent to about a 3-story building.
Oh, so it's 30, 40 feet up tall, yeah. What's our pain threshold on that little front grass area of the Bicenter, just kind of to the west? So you can kind of see the white, I don't know if that's the load-in structure area, just kind of in that space to there. I mean, you know, I know everybody gets up in arms about our public spaces, and I do too, but I just, you know, I'm not saying in the big area, but maybe just to the kind of left of that white in that space. Is that, no, I'm sorry, north of that. There you go, right in that area up in there, closer to the building. So it looks like it's part of the building structure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't, people are going to, if that's going to be painful to the look of it.
My recollection is there was some conversation about a site somewhere adjacent to the building, somewhere in there. I don't know from a physical perspective that there's a lot of limitations there.
Mm-hmm.
I think there may be a question about how that would integrate with the current
Sure.
contract with Global Spectrum and the facility, and whether you have a question about revenues going through that contract versus being independent for the city. I think that may be a question, because technically they have there's a drawing of property that they service in addition to the building, and it could create some questions.
Sure.
I would suggest possibly if Dion can share some insight. I know there was a lot of conversations about, or have been a lot of conversations about possible locations. I'm going to put him on the spot a little bit, might have some possible ideas to help kind of answer some of the questions, other options and things. And if not, we can go back and do some homework.
Yeah, I think if it helps to move forward, that staff will get some comfort from the commission on where they'd prefer it, that'd be great. But we only have the one proposal, so you can give us different ideas, because I wouldn't want to see, on behalf of Next Tech or staff, you come back and that's not quite it either. This one was just easy to see that it's just taken away a lot of future capabilities in that area. So, you know, if you'd like to come up and talk about other locations that you talked about, that'd be great. I don't know how much we can engineer and design this from up here.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
That's not our spot.
A lot of what the original conversation structure around was kind of this, if you will, from the Indian Rock area, kind of back to the west, if you will. And this is, when you look at park properties in there, you have to take several things into account. Proximity to residential, obviously being one of them for your tower fall heights and different stuff like this. One thing that was unique about this piece was that we were quite a ways from any residential pieces. We did discuss the future expansion or potential future expansion, and based on what we're seeing, we just don't see in the immediate future, and I say immediate future, the next 10 to 15 years, anything that we would put in that area. We do have, if you look on the northwest side right there of the fenced-in area, we have space available right now. Now, it's just a grassy area right now.
Sure.
We've talked about potentially different structures or different rides, if you will, as the park ages a little bit to try to continually keep it live and up to date. We've talked about different things we might want to do in there. For instance, one of the things that was discussed, and just an idea, was if you will, a vertical drop tower where all you have is just a water pit at the bottom and it just circulates amongst itself. It does not have to have its own body or its own pool. So things like that that are more self-enclosed or self-standing. We talked about different things like that. In terms of a splash park or splash pad, I do think we would have some other locations. This would probably be a good spot for it too, though, because of the proximity to the water park, because of the traffic that you have there. You've got the parking lot, kind of a natural fit. But when we talked about and discussed it internally, we didn't see that we would expand into that space in the immediate future. And again, thinking 10 to 15 years. In terms of other sites, from my chair, my perspective, we didn't have a lot of parks between Indian Rock and where we're talking about. So that's kind of how we ended up at this location. Now, if we want to go, we talked about I've had discussions with some different carriers about some stuff further south. And some of those would probably be, potential options, for instance, at Magnolia Hills. But that's a long ways from this location. So, and I don't want to speak from a technical standpoint because I don't fully understand exactly, the needs and what have you. But in terms of this location, the reason or how we got there was basically Indian Rock didn't work out, wasn't the right spot for it. So we were looking at the next closest thing within that window, and that's the next closest park that we had. On top of when we looked at it, we thought, this one probably fits because there's already a lot of tall light poles in there. It kind of blends. It fits. That's where we took it. We're certainly open to other thoughts or suggestions and willing to take a peek at other things. If you have thoughts, we'll certainly do it.
Did you look at any of the land further to the south? I know there's a lot of grassy area, or the west side of the Bicentennial Center parking lot is like grass overflow parking way back in the Midway Horn back there. It's just kind of like a dead, unused area. Was there, or is there an overlap on the comprehensive plan that kept you away from that?
To my knowledge, we didn't specifically look at that spot. And I know exactly where you're speaking of there. I know with some of the Bicentennial Center capital improvements they're looking at, one of the things was kind of a beautification of the entrance and what have you right there. I don't know how that would affect that. If we would then call it a gateway, probably isn't really a gateway to the city, a gateway to the Bicentennial Center. But I know they were talking about doing something with the streets there and some tree line and some lamps and some nice paths and what have you back and forth. Part of that would come through that area, but it would be on certainly the side of the property, not in the middle. And there's probably something that could be looked at there if you'd like us to take a peek at it. But
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of space up there. That may be a possibility we look at.
My concern, though, is exactly what he was saying, and that is that I think that was kind of called out as a beautification area, and putting a big tower right there might take away from these tree lines. The first thing you see when you come in is a big cell tower. I'm kind of torn because I feel what the mayor is saying, but I also agree that the tall towers around those light poles seems to blend in a little bit better. I just wish that little island of land just to the east of that building was a little bit bigger and we could squeeze it in there. I don't know if the yard sizes have to be exactly square, or if we could have a bigger, longer, you know what I'm talking about, the little piece there just to that area there. How do these yards generally need to be square, or can they, provided they have a certain amount of space?
Yeah, and it's not actually, it's on the other side of the building. I don't think you're going to see a good one with that construction shot, but in their site plan that they have, if you pull up their site plan where they had the little boxed-in area.
Yeah.
The suspense is killing us. Suspense. No, it's this one right here. The one with the purple box that's showing, there's application aerial view.
SP 13-1, yeah.
There.
Yeah.
Right on the other side of the sidewalk. Kind of a chopped up grassy area. You see it on the purple there. And then it's on the other side. And then it's easy to see, well, you got parking over there. We're probably not going to grow, we might lay down some pumps there to work on the park or something. And that's a huge area when you compare it to the metal building next to it. So it seemed like, why not go there and stay away from all of that clean grassy area that's on the north side of the sidewalk? That was my initial comment. It was just on the other side of the sidewalk, if it could be reconfigured from the standard, here's our square with 5 carriers, and we drop it on the page there, if it could be more of a rectangle or even an odder shape.
Well, and that's what I was
That's what I don't know. I can give the input to both parties that had it been there, then I wouldn't have any of these concerns that I have right now, that we're giving away our basic biggest green space in the area when we seem to have some potential other places.
My thoughts were the one just to the right of that building. I can't tell from here if it could fit in there. I don't know if we can page over a little bit to the right.
Yeah, any one of those areas.
You know, I'd be happy to, that area there, I don't know if it could basically occupy that whole little island space there. I mean, it's not really used for much of anything. If it obstructs the view too much of traffic, I wouldn't think so. It seems like a pretty soft curve there. But I just didn't know if you can configure we're not trying to reinvent your wheel. We're not engineers. We understand. We're just trying to show our willingness to
Absolutely.
The other thing I thought of, and maybe this is an infrastructure issue with the wiring you were talking about, but are there any plans to do anything with that old ice skating rink area in Oakdale? That concrete pad that just sits there in the middle of the park?
No immediate plans at this point. We've had some discussions on different stuff, and it was, painted for the festival, but no immediate plans in terms of a long-term change or approach.
And again, the other area that I could propose that you bring back, even though I won't be here, but the soccer fields that are right next to Indian Rock. I was going to talk about them the night of the Indian Rock Tower, but we were given the perception that height mattered. You know, it needed to be a 150-foot pole on top of Indian Rock, and it was specifically Indian Rock's height that kind of drove that one, but now we're at the same elevation compared to sea level. I would think in the Bicentennial Center is that little 3-field soccer park, and relocating one soccer field by expanding an area somewhere, or coming up with 3 more soccer fields, because I think you juggle balls already to keep the soccer kids going. You know, maybe that's a better area as well. So that's just a suggestion, but especially those 2 weird-shaped areas.
Mm-hmm. Is there any?
Would be my first.
I saw you guys were talking a little. Is this just too small here on the right, or?
If we were able to, let me tell you my concerns with that.
Sure.
And the first concern is it's kind of an odd-shaped property.
Right.
And let me, if the commission will take a moment, I'll kind of educate you as to why if you ever go by a cell site, you see the buildings, they're all square.
Right.
And with 5 carriers in this, they all put square buildings in, and different carriers per different size buildings. So when you get an odd-shaped property, it makes it a little tougher to
decide everything.
Those in. And frankly, what my concern is that another carrier comes back to you and says, well, I need to put in this building, and because it's not perfectly square, the area, I can't fit my building in there, so I need a
whole other site,
a whole new site.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So, with that said, if that area, I think there's some construction equipment in there and if we were able to the right of where your mouse is, in that general area, if we were to square that off, I think that would work. The only thing that does concern me a little bit about that is there's no utilities right there, so we'd have to run some more underground cabling, and that's a little bit of additional cost. The other area that you were looking at, again, that's kind of an odd shape. We're thinking we may be able to make it work, but again, that's kind of close to where you were before. So, and the other area that you originally talked about, adjacent to the Bicentennial Center, with that metal building, is the problem that presents is, it's my understanding that there's a large amount of underground cabling going into that, and to dig a foundation for 150-foot pole, you have to go down very, very, very far. We have to go down even further because it's a stealth pole. So it creates, and we have to go wider because it's a stealth pole.
Okay.
So that, you know, from a feasibility standpoint, that presents a lot of problems and would probably make that site unusable. So that's kind of where we're at. I will throw out one other option, is there is the 4-H area.
I wondered about that.
And that would, if, and I understand the concern there was with your contractor for the Bicentennial Center and getting their approval and working out, as earlier discussed, that arrangement proved to be pretty problematic. But if we could do that, one of the things to think about is then a stealth pole may not be required because we could put it back in the back where it's not as seen as much by the public.
And we're talking more like this parking area or just something in that, just in that general
I'm
area?
just thinking in that general area as a rule of thumb. I mean, if we could trade off for the stealth pole versus going back there and work out that agreement, I think that would be something that would be quite an option.
Yeah, there's no way you'd put it over there either.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Commissioners, if it would help you, I know the options you have, one of them indicates that you could request the applicant modify the proposal, and it gives you some examples of what that might be, and another would be to take it back to the Planning Commission. Might be helpful if Dean can come back up and kind of guide you so you kind of know what your options might be with regards to whether a modification on site would stay with you or go back, or how that might work for you.
And there's no reason that there couldn't be alternatives requested as well, alternative locations in the area.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. I think it would be good for Dean to answer that. But
multiple alternatives. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess it's always hindsight, but to sit here and say, boy, that's primary, and then it'd been nice to have a couple of secondaries, you probably would have gotten action on the secondaries, because that's what it seems like we're searching for. Mr. Andrew?
In response to Mr. Gage's question, I think if the commission had in mind a change to the pole location and the fenced-in equipment area location, and you had a specific, and we could tell you, and the applicants told you, yes, that will work, you just move it from here to here, then option 2 would work. But if you're asking us to go back and basically do some homework and explore multiple options, and I think the correct option would be to return the application to the Planning Commission to explore alternatives, and then we would go through the same process with them, and then they would come back with a recommendation of those alternatives, and we could either have what their recommendation is, or we could report back that it's not feasible for some reason. But in my experience in working with some of these and some that are in remote locations, you can choose a location that might look good on an aerial photo, but if it's not accessible to utilities that are needed to power the units or natural gas for cooling, then the location can be problematic. So we would have to do both a above surface look at it, and then we'd have to look at what is around it, because you don't want to choose a site that then they can't get the necessary utilities to support it.
Yeah,
sure.
But if you want us to look at several different alternate sites, I think the appropriate thing to do would be to return this application to the Planning Commission and ask the applicants and staff to explore alternative locations in the vicinity.
But initially, what you're saying is if we instructed, or in the motion for option 2, essentially B, for it to be returned with an alternate pole location adjacently or close there to the south, that would get it to where it could get reconfigured into one of those 2 odd-shaped areas.
yes, if you want to limit it to that. If you want us to basically zoom out and look at a number of alternatives, that would be an option. But if you want to narrow it to say, to send it back to determine whether the location pointed out southwest of the storage building or directly east of the storage building is feasible, then those would be the two that we would focus on.
Right. To me, I don't need to send it back through the whole horn, because either one of those other two odd-shaped pieces right next to that storage building would work just fine, to me.
I'm wondering, just again, I want to make it as easy for you as we can. Other than just the future growth of the potential pool, I don't have too much heartache about the location. I think it actually fits in relatively well. Your design looks decent. Could that pool, and I understand the Parks and Rec don't have a lot of plans right now currently, I would assume the biggest addition to the pool, Mayor, would be that however many meter pool. Could that still run down that
I would just
that
tell
west
you,
side?
ignore the pool.
Yeah.
Put it out of your mind. What I saw is we're giving away our biggest green space available
Over
when
there.
we've got two other short, odd space things that might get a little shed to store tools in or something there. And that's what just didn't make sense to me. Now, if they can rework it into one of those two, we know that outside of shrubs and planters, we're probably not going to do anything significant in those two areas, where whether it's 10 years or 50 years down the road, that's a large enough area that even expanding the parking into there or whatever it is, it could be beneficial to us. So I hate to see us give up the largest, most beneficial spot there when one of those two others could work.
And just so I'm clear, which two are we still kind of considering, just to, because it sounded like this corner one probably wouldn't work. The 4-8,
That one.
sounds like that one probably wouldn't
And then
work that well,
one.
though.
Yep.
I mean, was that, I don't want to send you on a fool's quest trying to,
I think we can explore that one. I will tell you that the first one that you mentioned, the one to the right of the storage building there, if the commission was to vote to move it to there, I think we would run with that and see if we could do all of our requirements and
I think they're motioning for you to get on the mic so the at-home players can hear.
we would be willing to take a look at that area to the right and see if that met all of our needs, and appreciate not having to come back and
Yeah.
Yep, that would avoid
process.
it going back through the planning commission and everything, and I think if the commission's will is dictated by one of those areas, then staff can easily run with that and bring back the alternate in that area.
I think that would be fine.
Sure. And just out of my own curiosity, what do we expect? We keep talking about 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, on and on. Hard to estimate, but what do you estimate the life of these really are? I mean, in 10, 15 years, will we still be using these poles, or do you think at that time technology will change enough where these may not be here?
The technology changes every day, and we try to keep up with it, but it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
I will tell you, though, that the structures that technology is on, the poles, they don't change very often.
So 15 years, we're probably still going to see this pole.
The
here.
antennas, the fiber going to them, things like that, they change a lot, but the structure usually is the structure.
Okay, so we're here for the long haul probably if we
Yes,
put this in, okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You can clarify this in your motion, but the way I'm interpreting your action is that basically you are in general agreement with what the Planning Commission recommended. However, you disagree with their finding that the location here would not negatively impact the expansion of Kenwood Park or the Kenwood Cove Aquatic Center, and that you could probably agree with that if it was one of those other two locations.
Thank you. Yes. Any further questions or discussion? I'd entertain a motion.
I move we approve resolution number 136994, including the recommendations from the Planning Commission, and requesting that the applicant modify the proposal and approve a special permit for a plan that changes the proposed pole location.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the resolution. Mr. Bingson?
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Andrew, am I correct that alteration in the factual findings should be noted as well? Or your recommendation, if that's the thought of the commission?
Yes, that they are not in agreement with that item in the resolution in which it states that the proposed location presently would not interfere with Kenwood Cove, as long as they call out that they do not agree with that.
Yeah. Commissioner Crawford, that was just the only concern, that right now the resolution makes the statement that we understood was different than the sense of the commission, and I think if that's your
So we're
thought
not
in the making the motion, we could certainly
To change the resolution?
modify the resolution, if I'm understanding Mr. Andrews' thought correctly.
Would that be a different numbered resolution?
No, I think not. It would just be
Okay.
a matter of modifying that finding to reflect that you were concerned that this was potentially in conflict with future expansion, but that the alternative sites that you wish to explore would not be, something to that effect.
Okay. Then I move we approve Resolution 13-6994 with the changes being the location of the proposed location of the pole, and include 1 through 6 of the Planning Commission. Is that going to do it? No?
I think if you, within the motion, if you just note that the commission wasn't in agreement, yeah, that we were in a disagreement with, is it number 2?
The proposed
Yeah.
location.
And that by choosing an alternate location, we would be in agreement with that finding.
Okay. Do I need to restate that motion?
If you would, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Approve Resolution 13-6994 to change the resolution to the proposed location, tower design, height, and aesthetic appearance of the proposed facility would not be visually obtrusive or incompatible with its surroundings, which are all public, quasi-public facilities, and including the special permit application, the Planning Commission 1 through 6 desires, and changing the proposed location. Will that do it?
Well, I think our commission,
Did
I think we,
And I'll paraphrase it back.
yeah.
Yeah. But I would need a seconder before I can paraphrase it.
I'll second it.
Okay, so my understanding is that we have a motion to approve resolution number 13-6994. However, choosing an alternate location for the proposed pole out of concerns that we do not agree with the finding that the location proposed would not inhibit the future expansion of that public facility, and by choosing the alternate location, it would remove that concern. Does that sound right?
Sounds good.
Okay.
That's the way I heard it.
Okay. Good there? Okay. We have that motion and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carried 5-0.
All right, item number 7.2, application number P13-22A for the acceptance of offered utility easement and access control dedications on a final plat of a portion of city-owned property acquired as part of the North Ohio Overpass Project. Subject property is located on the north and south sides of York Avenue west of North Ohio Street.
Mr. Andrew?
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. As Commissioners, you may be familiar with these two locations from discussions in executive sessions about city-owned real estate, but I'm just focusing on the platting aspect of that. We have others who can address your questions about ownership, but the area in question is on either side of York Avenue north side and south side of York Avenue, just west of North Ohio. And there were various tracts that were acquired in 2004, and as you recall, in order to keep Ohio Street open, the overpass was shifted to the west of the former alignment of Ohio Street so that Ohio could remain open during its construction. And because of that, the majority of acquisition occurred on the west side of North Ohio Street. We've held a number of study sessions with the City Commission, Planning Commission about the future development along North Ohio, and as a result of that, there was a North Ohio Gateway Overlay District created, and that overlay district covers both sides of Ohio from I-70 down to North Street. This is a city-initiated plat to create 2 building lots on the west side of Ohio. We have determined how much property is needed in order to maintain the overpass and the associated aesthetics and landscape improvements, and so we think it's time that you could replat the remaining areas into 2 separate development sites. If you recall, Midway Wholesale, which owns property on the north side of York, expressed interest in requiring the north property for a business expansion. Their agreement to purchase that property, they did not meet their deadlines for closing on it. Nonetheless, there's still a benefit to everyone to replat this and plat it into a lot regardless of who ultimately purchases and develops that. So the design that we have creates a Lot 1, Block 1 that is north of York Avenue. That lot contains about 60,000 square feet. Its underlying zoning is light industrial. Because of the shape of it, we see it as being more valuable and useful to Midway Wholesale as an expansion parcel rather than a standalone parcel, but it could potentially be a standalone parcel. But it would have I-2 zoning and be subject to the Gateway Overlay District. The south lot is harder to see. It's down here at the bottom of the screen. It's much smaller. It takes 3 combined tracts and combines them into a 13,000 square foot lot on the south side of York Avenue. It has underlying zoning of heavy industrial. It's not really large enough to be a standalone lot, but it would be of value to the abutting owner to the west or south as an expansion piece. And the disposition of that property is addressed on another agenda item. But that would also be subject to the North Ohio Gateway Overlay District. In addition to being small in size, this south lot has utility easements here and here for an AT&T cable that was relocated as part of the overpass project, and then there are city water lines that cross the property. You have a color drawing in your packet that locate those 2 items. We have had discussions with the potential owner of the south lot. They understand the presence of those easements. They would allow for fencing for outdoor storage, but it would not allow any buildings to be constructed within these easement areas, and they understand that situation. The Planning Commission voted 7-0 to approve this replat as proposed, subject to 2 conditions, and this is unusual, but it's a product of the way that the property was acquired by the city. This area here will not be designated as right-of-way. It will retain its fee title ownership the same as if it was acquired, but it will be available for franchise and public utilities. So you are in the situation here where you are both the dedicator and acceptor of easements and restricted access. So if you are in agreement with the plat as laid out, a motion should be made to authorize the mayor to sign the plat, and in doing so, he would be dedicating restricted access along Ohio here, and dedicating these easements as part of the plat, and also accepting those on behalf of the city because the city is currently the owner. We have John Harvey, the city surveyor, who has worked extensively in this area here. If you have surveying questions, and Mike Scragg can address questions about Midway Wholesale, and obviously Mr. Bankston is here to talk about any acquisitions done as part of the overpass. But we have reviewed the plat. It meets all of our requirements for a subdivision plat. Just has a couple exceptions as to how the status of that right-of-way would be identified as fee title instead of right-of-way. With that, I'd be open to any questions.
Any questions of staff? Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Andrew. Do we have any public comment on this item? Seeing none, I bring it back to the Commission for action.
Mayor, I move we adopt application P13-2/2A and authorize you to sign the plat to both dedicate and accept the easement and restricted access dedications on behalf of the city.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve application number P-13, or P13-2A, for the acceptance of the offered utility easements and access control dedications. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? That motion carried 5-0. We now move into administration.
Item 8.1, second reading, ordinance number 13-10685, establishing a SAFB RIFS multi-year capital improvements fund.
This ordinance number 13-10685 was passed on first reading April 1st. Since that time, there have been no comments received. Do we have any public comments on this item today? Seeing none, I bring it back to the Commission for action.
Mayor, I move we adopt on second reading ordinance -13-10685.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve on second reading ordinance number 13-10685. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Angel?
Aye.
Commissioner Crawford?
Aye.
Commissioner Householder?
Aye.
Commissioner Shirley?
Aye.
Mayor Jennings.
Aye. That motion carried 5-0.
Item 8.2, second reading, ordinance number 13-10689, establishing a solid waste multi-year capital improvements fund.
This ordinance was also passed on first reading April the 1st, and since that time, there have been no comments received. Do we have any public comments on this item today? Seeing none, I bring it back to the Commission for action.
I move we adopt ordinance number 13-10689 on second reading.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve on second reading ordinance number 13-10689. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Angel?
Aye.
Commissioner Crawford?
Aye.
Commissioner Householder?
Aye.
Commissioner Shirley?
Aye.
Mayor Jennings.
Aye. That motion carried 5-0.
Item 8.3, second reading, ordinance number 13-10690, establishing a multi-year capital improvements fund for Kenwood Cove.
This ordinance as well passed on April the 1st on first reading. Since that time, there have been no comments received. Do we have any public comments on this item today? Seeing none, I bring it back to the Commission for action.
I move we approve on second reading ordinance number 13-10690, establishing a multi-year capital improvements fund for Kenwood Cove.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve on second reading ordinance number 13-10690. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Angel?
Aye.
Commissioner Crawford?
Aye.
Commissioner Householder?
Aye.
Commissioner Shirley?
Aye.
Mayor Jennings.
Aye. That motion carried 5-0.
Item 8.4, resolution number 13-6995, authorizing the mayor to execute the agreement to transfer real estate with the Rebecca Lynn Augustine Trust Number 2.
Mr. Bingston.
Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners. This presents the opportunity for the city to fulfill an obligation that it undertook in October of 2004, partly facilitated by the plat you just saw. And you may have noted that Lot 1, Block 2 that Mr. Andrew referred to, that tract that would be at the southwest corner of the intersection of York and Ohio. The story begins with the acquisition of the partial interest that had to be acquired in kind of a second phase as the Ohio Overpass project was constructed. And at that time, as part of those negotiations by the city's relocation agent, the undertaking by the city was to seek acquisition of the abandoned rail right-of-way completing after the abandonment of the rail by Union Pacific Railroad. To try to make a long story short, that process ultimately occurred with the disclaimer by the railroad, some discussion about what proceedings were necessary in order to complete that abandonment, but nonetheless, an ultimate determination and indication from the Triplet Trust and the Augustine Trust as the Triplet Trust's assignee of their willingness to accept this alternative tract in that it does adjoin property that they hold and was of some potential value to them. And as Mr. Andrew pointed out, relatively small tract with some complications relating to the easements, but nonetheless, and I think to the city's benefit in terms of not having to undergo the actual acquisition of additional land in order to satisfy that obligation, had received the indication from the Augustine Trust of their willingness to accept this tract in place of that obligation of trying to acquire the abandoned rail tract. That appeared to be beneficial to all concerned, and that is staff's recommendation that you authorize that substitution, if you will, of that currently owned tract in place of what was the city's original obligation with regard to that abandoned rail right-of-way. Be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of staff? Do we have any public comment on this item? Seeing none, I bring it to the commission for any discussion and action.
Mayor, I move we adopt Resolution 13-6995, authorizing you to execute an agreement to transfer real estate with the Rebecca Lynn Augustine Trust, number 2, dated April 21st, 1997.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve resolution number 13-6995. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? That motion carried 5-0.
Item 8.5, Property Maintenance Code.
Mr. Scruggs?
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm going to take the opportunity to apologize in advance for the length of this report and the level of detail, but I think we all acknowledged in the study sessions the significance of this issue as well as the complexity of it. And now that you've put forth the effort and the Building Advisory Board has as well, I want to be sure to do a sufficient job in terms of reporting out this issue. The city clerk informed me that this item has the distinction of having the longest item description that she recalls, and I'm going to take the opportunity to skip that at the moment, and I'll double back to that as we get into this in a little bit more detail. As background, I believe you're aware that we've taken the 2009 International Property Maintenance Code as kind of the starting point of a draft document that we could use to create a consolidated property maintenance code for the city of Salina. We did have to review that in light of state statutes and local ordinances. It wasn't something that we could adopt whole cloth as it was written and be statutorily compliant, nor did it completely reflect what we wanted to do locally. As you know, we've had multiple study sessions with the City Commission to review it in detail and get your policy direction, present local revisions that were developed in response to that direction, and then also you indicated a desire to consider this action for final consideration prior to the transition, given the significant investment that you've made in this topic. Out of those study sessions, it was referred to the Building Advisory Board for review, and staff was authorized to present the draft property maintenance code that we had developed following the study sessions, and also was specifically asked to find out from the Building Advisory Board whether they were willing to serve as an appeal body for the property maintenance code appeals. Staff made multiple presentations to the Building Advisory Board, both initial report at the regular meeting. It was referred to a subcommittee of the Building Advisory Board, and I do want to take the opportunity to commend them once again for their willingness to thoroughly look at an issue and serve in a subcommittee role. They did that very willingly. They came in very informed, and it was obvious that the subcommittee members had read it in detail and had some very good input. Following the subcommittee's review and recommendations, that was reported out to the full Building Advisory Board at a regular meeting, and they then went over it in detail and provided additional recommendations. So getting to the Building Advisory Board recommendations in particular, you were provided two documents that I hope were helpful and didn't add to any confusion, but there were two documents in the packet, one entitled the Building Advisory Board Recommendations, that took the original draft that was presented to them in its entirety and showed all of their recommendations as red line edits. There's a second document entitled the Building Advisory Board Revisions-Notes, and that was just the selected sections that were identified for revision by the Building Advisory Board. Within the staff report, we tried to point out noteworthy Building Advisory Board recommendations. Obviously, that wasn't all of them, but the ones that we felt that were more than kind of a straightforward revision of a requirement as it related to practical code requirements, but more of a policy decision that we wanted to call to your attention. So working through those, historic buildings is the first item. When we left the study session with you, the proposed approach was to eliminate that section altogether, which would thereby make historic buildings fully subject to the property maintenance code. After a subcommittee discussion, we came up with the proposed revision with the intention of trying to strike a balance between code compliance and historic preservation. The priority would be safety in the event that safety could be maintained, but a historic element could also be preserved. That's kind of the intention of that proposed language. So the presumption is if it's not a historic element, full compliance is expected. If it is a historic element, then it still needs to remain safe, but if the historic element can be preserved, it presents that opportunity. The subcommittee also recognized that the property maintenance code language about salvage may not be entirely clear in terms of the expectation of the city in a demolition scenario to exercise some discretion on obtaining the salvage value of materials and the opportunity to roll that into a bid where a demolition contractor would bid a net cost after any salvage value. So the amendment to the language with respect to salvage materials was basically intended to preserve maximum discretion for the City Commission when facing an issue like that. The discussion on weeds noted two things. One was that there are circumstances due to terrain that make it difficult to maintain grass turf at 8 inches. So the added language tried to identify an exception for slopes in excess of 2 to 1. And then there was also discussion about the reduction in height from 12 inches to 8 inches, which I'll get to later. With respect to inoperative vehicles, there was a considerable discussion on the part of the Building Advisory Board about what I would call hobbyist or hobby painting of vehicles, as well as overhaul of vehicles inside a structure or out of a structure. In the end, it was recognized that just striking the language about painting from the property maintenance code would fall back to the existing codes that are already in place as it relates to spray booths and painting. I would note that the fire code provides that you can paint up to 9 square feet without the need for a spray booth. Beyond that, the code requires a spray booth. Then additionally, we recognized, or I actually realized over the weekend, that our inoperative vehicle language is geared at vehicles being able to be driven on the street, and we probably do need to clarify equipment that's not intended to be driven on the street. Knowing from a code enforcement standpoint, we have helicopter hulls and Cat 40s and backhoes, and so I think between first and second reading we'll need to add a little bit broader language in that regard. The next item identified in the staff report is the pest elimination responsibility falling to owners. The property maintenance code got pretty complicated in trying to parse out an occupant responsibility versus an owner responsibility, and there was conversation on the part of the subcommittee that practically speaking landlords as owners deal with that on a case-by-case basis with their tenants, and so as long as we left it open that it was a responsibility of the owner and the tenant, they could sort it out amongst themselves. And we did confirm with Human Relations that that is consistent with the housing approach in terms of a multifamily unit if there's infestation. So the Building Advisory Subcommittee believed that the language that's proposed is representative of what current practice is in the community today. There was also a recognition as it relates to mechanical appliances that the language as it was written required a mechanical appliance, which includes a chimney, to be fully functioning or removed. It didn't leave any alternative to somewhat abandoned in place, and there's a recognition that there's plenty of instances where a fireplace and chimney may not be intended to be in use anymore, but it would be impractical to remove it. So staff drafted some language in response to that to create a scenario where you could secure it in place provided that it is incapable of producing combustion gases. The concern is that you produce some harmful combustion gases with a ineffective mechanical appliance. There was quite a bit of discussion about electrical equipment. The property maintenance code gives a very detailed itemization of electrical equipment that would have to be addressed in a flooding scenario, and also presumed that you could get a written confirmation from an equipment manufacturer that it didn't need to be replaced. And there was a recognition that that's pretty unlikely, and the net effect would probably be removal and replacement of items just for the lack of the ability to get any confirmation that met the code requirement. So the proposed language amends that to provide that it's acceptable to have written confirmation from a licensed electrician. The thinking is that it does then require review, requires someone to have offered up a written opinion and a basis to proceed. I mentioned previously there was some additional Building Advisory Board feedback regarding the reduction of the height from 12 inches to 8 inches in terms of the weed requirements, and there was concern about the practicality of that, and so there was general. I don't even know if I'd describe it as consensus, but there was general discussion about wanting to relay to you as a City Commission concern about reducing that. On the other hand, there's also discussion about the difficulty of once someone gets a notice how long they have and how much taller it gets. And I tried to explain the thinking was if we start at 8 inches, it may not be as objectionable by the time we get through the process. There's also a very specific suggestion that the city should start their enforcement or review efforts with their own property as a means of testing the practicality of some of these requirements, and a recognition that there would be possibly be an opportunity to do that in the 90-day implementation period for the effective date. So now I get to the next step, which is conversion of all that discussion and input about the draft property maintenance code into what we are proposing to be Chapter 31 of the Salina Code. And that's where I'd like to go back to the item description, if I may. We looked at the code, and as you probably know, the code chapters are organized alphabetically. So our opportunities seem to be to come up with a creative name for this chapter that started with H, or to create the necessary opening in the code where it would fit in as a property maintenance code. And it turned out that it really, in the overall scheme of things, doesn't seem to be that problematic. But I would tell you that changing the numbering for an ordinance is a standalone topic, so we weren't able to roll these together as one ordinance, so we had to deal with some of these separately. So just in the process of moving chapters around and making room, you have an ordinance that removes Chapter 30.5, which is currently entitled Public Health, and it relates to smoking regulations, and relocates those regulations whole cloth into Chapter 17, which is the Health and Sanitation chapter. The next item that we're proposing is repealing Chapter 32, which is entitled Sales. It has one section in it that is completely redundant of statutory requirements, and so we felt like it would be sufficient to delete that chapter in its entirety. We're then proposing recodifying Chapter 31, which is currently Public Utilities, as the newly vacated Chapter 32, which then opens up Chapter 31 to be the Property Maintenance Code. Then additionally, within Chapter 31, we're trying to consolidate all of the different property maintenance requirements that are sprinkled throughout the codes. So we're taking Article 4 of Chapter 8 regarding the abatement of dangerous structures, Article 5 of Chapter 8 regarding structures damaged by fire, explosion, or windstorm, Article 7 of Chapter 8 regarding toxic chemical remediation, or what we more commonly refer to as meth houses, Chapter 18 in its entirety dealing with housing, and Chapter 24, Article 1 entitled Nuisances, and we're consolidating all that into a new Chapter 31. It will also then become necessary to take various references to the notice and appeal process that was previously in Chapter 24 and cross-reference those to the correct locations in Chapter 31. We're deleting about 5 sections out of the sanitation code that relate to trash storage and trash containers, because Chapter 31 now has a more overarching statement about that. We're recodifying the sections regarding the sidewalks generally and putting them into Chapter 31 since they're a property maintenance item as well. And then we are recodifying Article 3, Division 3 of Chapter 38 regarding inoperable vehicles and putting that in Chapter 31 as well. And lastly, we have an ordinance that stands alone that relates to yard parking, and it would be an amendment to Chapter 38, Article 1, which is the adoption of the standard traffic ordinances, and creates 2 different circumstances, prohibited circumstances, as it relates to either straddling the edge of pavement or parking in a front yard. So that is kind of the nuts and bolts of what we identified as being necessary to turn this into Chapter 31. In the process of working through that final draft, staff and legal counsel did identify some additional revisions that we wanted to call to your attention and are shown as red lines within the draft ordinance. The only things that we called out as red lines are things that we believe to be substantive, just picking up language and inserting it as it currently exists in the code. We did not specifically call out as red lines. Also noted in the staff report is that the draft that was presented to you with the packet that went out last week had all the contents as it related to substantive. I will be giving the city attorney an opportunity to update you on the procedural aspects related to enforcement and appeals, which he has been working on as well. So, as it relates to staff or legal counsel edits that we felt were noteworthy is the weed standard, which we previously talked about going from 12 to 8 inches. But then there are 2 exceptions that we wanted to call to your attention. I believe we discussed one of them at least in study session, but we didn't propose final language until this draft. The first exception is an attempt to recognize the fact that public parks and educational or governmental entities may have areas set aside that are not mowed to the standard that's proposed in terms of the 8 inches, and to create an exception for that. Lakewood would be a good example of a park area that may not be maintained to that standard. The second one, it reads very legalistically, but the intention is to recognize the fact that there are property owners that are maintaining their properties and growing an agricultural crop on their undeveloped properties with the intent of getting an classification of agriculture for ad valorem tax purposes. And that is something that's supported by Kansas statute. That is a process that the county assessor recognizes. So we are trying to balance the appearance and the aesthetic and blighting influences of maintaining a crop, as well as how it may abut a residential property or an occupied property. And so the language in exception number 2 calls for homogeneity, meaning it needs to be a consistent crop. We've had instances where property owners have basically, in my opinion, let the property grow up and tried to classify it as silage. The intention is not that. If you think, there are some locations in town that probably come to mind where they've grown wheat as a stand of agricultural crop for this purpose. We also then tried to create a buffer boundary around the outside of that property, 15 feet from the property line, as well as outside of any front, side, or rear yards. But if you think of a scenario where it's a residential subdivision and a number of lots are all vacant, we've worded it such that there isn't an expectation to maintain all the side and rear yards of each one of those lots. It's just the ones that adjoin an adjacent developed or property that's under separate ownership. So we're trying to balance that appearance and blighting issue with the legitimate intent of getting the agricultural classification.
But it wouldn't allow me to have a vegetable garden in my backyard.
Yes, cultivated gardens are permissible currently.
Okay.
So, yes.
I'm thinking my tomato plant hopefully is higher than, I hope
by
it's
the
higher than
definition,
8 inches.
It's a little scary that I know all this off the top of my head, but by the definition of weeds, a cultivated garden is not a weed.
Well, but it
So-
says free from weeds or plant growth.
Yeah, well,
That's what jumped out at me.
right, but as I say, if you go back to the weed definition, that's
The
gonna...
definition of weeds.
Right.
has
And
it. Okay.
okay, so, and I think I had the same thing that ran through my head in that area. There, through our neighborhood, underneath the utility lines, there's perennial grass that grows up to about mid-calf or over calf, and it's not mowed. That's the entire height of it down through those areas, but it's in backyards, and then part of it's green grass and part of it is that qualifies because that's homogeneous to the area, or a qualifying grass, or
Well, the way this is written is we are trying to permit the circumstance where you have a vacant property that you are trying to get the agricultural classification for property tax purposes. In the scenario that you described, that won't get you that property tax classification because it's a residential lot. And so the expectation is developed lots are going to be maintained to that standard with the exception of cultivated gardens, slopes in excess of 2 to 1, and that's basically the only two scenarios that the current code provides for. So I'd be happy to take more questions, and I'm sure I will here at the end. But moving on, in terms of inoperative vehicles, there was an additional exception created, exception number 2, and the intention is to provide for the circumstance where someone needs to make a short duration repair to a vehicle that they're dependent on for employment, recognizing that they may not have the opportunity to do that inside of a building. So we tried to create verbiage that kept it short in duration, kept it isolated so that it wasn't necessarily a hobbyist repair, but it was an essential repair, basically. I've somewhat described the yard parking ordinance, but if you looked at that language, we are proposing 2 provisions that essentially prohibit straddling of the pavement edge, whether that's curb or whether that's pavement, as well as parking in a front yard without meeting the zoning requirements as it relates to surfacing. And the reason for that is currently that is not a ticketable offense. This would make it a traffic violation that you could get a ticket. Presently, you get a zoning violation notice and so many days to resolve the problem, and you move the car and start all over again. So this is a more enforceable or practical way to enforce that requirement.
And as this is maybe being discussed in a residential aspect, there's an area of town that has auctions out on Broadway, okay, every once in a while, and it's an unsurfaced between it and the restaurant next door. But I know there's people that park there. So that would make that an immediately citable area, essentially, for those kind of things.
I believe so. The only reason I hesitated is that we need to confirm the zoning category, but presuming that it requires surfacing in that front yard area for parking, then yes, it would be citable. The practical difficulty is you've got the vehicle owner parking in what appears to be an acceptable configuration, so it would require education and most likely warnings or education of the property owner first before it would be practical to cite those vehicle owners.
Okay. Is there any ability to carve in exception? I think of like for the ability, maybe the zoning takes care of it, but for the ability for that not to work, but people to be able to park all over the really beautiful green grass up by the baseball fields at Dean Evans for the fireworks seems to be kind of like a contradiction. That would be one of those.
Right.
Yeah.
You won't let me do it routinely, so, and I know these are things that we talked about in study session that are going to be your fill the way through. You would hope that there wouldn't be those kind of ticketable things, and then this same type of thing occurs, by the Bicentennial Center or in the park or on,
Right.
on some area throughout the town or schools or whatever.
I understand your point, and one possibility, we grant the city manager authority to allow parking in certain circumstances on a limited
Special
basis,
event.
special event basis. That might be a way to deal with the fireworks parking at Dean Evans. As it relates to, parking for a business or industry, if that was a concern, we would probably need to go back and look at our zoning requirements as it relates to surfacing standards, which the Planning Commission is currently doing and should be coming back to the City Commission in the near future.
Mike, when they talk about surfacing, in the past it's just been rock or gravel. Is that what we're still requiring? I mean, if somebody just throws down some rock or gravel, they can still park in their front yard?
That is one of the issues that the Planning Commission is taking up, is that surfacing standard. We have paving requirements in certain locations, but in agricultural, residential, industrial, it is a gravel standard is acceptable currently. So all this does is requires whatever surfacing the zoning regulations require. As I said, the Planning Commission is taking up the broader issue of whether gravel is an appropriate paving surface in certain zoning categories.
And is the public, our new public zoning would be the same as the residential, I'm guessing, for the parking requirements?
It is a standalone zoning category, and Dean may have to help me on what the parking standard is. I don't know that off the top of my head.
I know there's grassy areas around the school when they have big, whatever, the school carnivals or
Right.
football, they're parking in those empty lots with their grass.
Special events are difficult, and schools, in particular, are intentionally located in neighborhoods for that to be a neighborhood school. And when you have an exceptional amount of parking, it either loads the streets or it's going to load the off-street unpaved areas.
Well, it's an area it's an area we can refine as we sort of go along. I think we're primarily looking at residential on this currently, is what we're really, I agree we need to refine that, but I think this is really trying to address residential yard parking. My only thought was, I was concerned that we only discussed the front yard area, but not side yards with that. Is there any reason for the deletion of that?
No, we were just so focused on front yards, the side yards got away from us, I
As
guess.
somebody who lives next to it, well, I don't live there anymore, but has a building next to an alleyway, and they decided that parking next to their house was a thing, I would probably want the side yards included in that language as well, because if there's a loop, they'll
Right.
find it, yeah.
Yeah, and it would be easy enough just to say if they're not parked on an
Unimproved area.
on
a
an
residential
unimproved area
lot.
that's not compliant with the zoning requirements.
And then if they do improve an area, like we don't want people basically graveling their whole front yard, do they still fall under a coverage standard as well? I would assume there's only so much coverage you can do with paved or surfaced areas. Is that a Dean Andrew question?
Dean will help me
No
out.
Arizona landscape?
It's
Is that what
limited
you're
to
starting?
60%.
What's 60%?
Yes, whether it's paving or gravel, you can only do 60% of your front yard with a driving surface.
And is there any definition as to, I'm sure there is, as far as maintaining that somebody can't say, oh, 10 years ago I put gravel out here,
Right.
there, you can still see 2 rocks here.
Right.
Do we have sort of a standard that we say, well,
No.
okay.
Other than
we-
there's got to be gravel there that
Yeah.
will be an all-weather surface.
Right.
If
Yeah, we
there's-
need
if
one,
there's-
yeah.
If there's mud holes or visible dirt and mud, then it wouldn't meet
Yeah.
this definition of gravel
And
surface.
any discussion about definitions of that area? Again, what we don't want to see is a bunch of, huge trucks come out here and just dumping gravel in people's front yard, and them just kind of making a circle of stuff and saying, okay, there I am. I would like to define that more down the road and make sure that that's a clearly defined area that isn't just sort of hodgepodge there, because it really doesn't look any better or help anything any better than. And what about siding if those parking areas are above main sewer lines or things like that, where,
We currently allow paved parking on top of utility easements, which that's another issue that is on our radar to address, not necessarily to prohibit that, but
Right.
be more specific in what's allowed in a public utility. But our current practice is to allow paved or gravel parking
Over
on top
there.
of a utility easement.
Okay.
So some of the issues that you've raised are very appropriate for the discussion the Planning Commission is currently having on paved parking standards. So I think if the yard parking makes it an offense to be in violation of the zoning requirements, that at least gets it to the point that it's a ticket rather than a zoning violation
Sure,
notice.
sure.
And then as we refine the zoning parking regulations, we can address some of the other
okay,
issues.
good. It's a good start, don't get me wrong at all. I mean, that's
Yeah, you've raised all very good, valid points.
they've
and that's
all
what's made
had,
it so hard to
yeah.
draft some of this language. I've got a couple more things, and then I think I'm done. We do have a delayed effective date of 90 days on the ordinances that are being presented to you. We did have a conversation about a financial assistance program. We haven't forgot about that. That'll take 2 steps. One is to work with the utility building to allow for the opportunity for donations if customers want to do that. The other is converting what are currently home grant standards to a local grant application. And then we get into the repeal items and those type of things. There is no direct fiscal impact noted as part of this action. And then I think I'll turn it over to Mr. Bankson to report on the appeals and enforcement aspects. And then I'd be happy to speak with you item by item as far as City Commission actions and recommendations. But I'd be happy to take questions on what I've presented first, if that works.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea. On the inoperable motor vehicles or unlicensed motor vehicles, I know we had a lot of different discussion and study session. It looks like they did too at the Building Authority Board. The part that I'm questioning or wondering is similarly enclosed area designed and lawfully utilized for such purposes. It doesn't sound like it describes a home garage where somebody may be working on their car. Is it? Are we talking about two different things? That's talking about the commercial, all of the commercial auto locations where work's done, or this applies as well to anybody that works on their car in their garage?
Right. Now, from the property maintenance code standpoint, it applies to all structures and all zoning categories, and so it's intended to be broader in scope. And in terms of the language that you referenced, I think it's just trying to keep the options open of something that may be enclosed, sufficiently enclosed, but is not just your typical garage. I don't know that I can give you a good example off the top of my head, but a carport, and it would have to be enclosed. A carport or something that's not fully enclosed wouldn't meet the requirement.
So an enclosed garage, any high school kid can pull stuff off his motor and change it all around and take 6 months doing it and come back out and do it, or Norm can, or whatever.
Yeah, in fact,
we just can't do it in our front yards.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
In fact,
As much as you want to.
The reason for the insertion of parking was a recognition that someone may buy a Mustang haul and keep it in their garage for years, planning to work on it, but never really get around to it. So if it's inside, the only thing that's really of concern is spray painting.
Right. Right. Okay. The other thing is on the pest elimination, and I think you answered it when you said the landlords, realtors. I think that you spoke about. When I read it, I said, to me it looked like that the owner was required to make it infestation free before they leased it, which is what our desire would be, because we've heard some really bad stories. Right. But then it goes on to say that the occupant and the owner shall be responsible. So to me, it seems like if the occupant comes in and they're the ones that called their cockroach friends to inhabit the house, that the owner is still just as weightily required as the occupant, and we don't have anything to protect the owner.
Well, and that was part of the subcommittee discussion, was there's a recognition that at that point, in the scenario that you described, that's going to be between the landlord and the occupant, and depending on how they've structured the lease and depending on what they might want to do in small claims court or however they want to deal with their tenant, they can take it up with their tenant rather than the city having to be the arbiter of which of you needs to sort that out.
Okay, so we would encourage them to take legal means, but we take enforcement means with the owner.
If they're, well, yeah, we would cite the owner, and then they can deal with their tenant. So the other, with respect to infestation prior to renting, there's an entirely separate provision that prohibits allowing someone to own, to occupy or lease a structure that's in violation of these codes in general. So if you were a landlord renting an infested apartment, you would be in violation, and if you're the occupant and you could demonstrate that, I would think you would have good grounds to say that's not my responsibility.
Okay. Further questions of Mr. Scray for what he presented?
I should note Don Mars, chairman of the Building Advisory Board, is here as well, and he participated in the subcommittee review as well. So I anticipate that he may have some input at the
And-
appropriate time.
Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, I guess, there's several sections in here that I have questions about and that concern me, but at this point, I don't know that my input is really necessary, so I'll probably save my notes and pass them on to the newly elected commissioners. If this doesn't go through today, then they can either be concerned or not and go from there. So.
Well, and our intention, and it was a push to get it wrapped up and get to you, but we did do everything we could to get it to you so that you'd have first reading before you, second, you'd have opportunity to give us any instruction you wanted between first and second reading. So I would encourage you to share whatever concerns you have.
Yeah, 304.5 foundation walls. I know that you worked very hard to remove a lot of the subjective type wording in there. I think as an engineer, you could probably put two engineers together and watch them argue over what is reasonable as far as plumbness and cracks in a foundation.
Right.
And I don't know whether the overall concern is foundation that is ruled as a safety hazard by a qualified engineer, or whether, you know, this is just another one of those areas that kind of remains that it's like two different sets of eyes could say there's enough cracks, that's unreasonable. I don't know what reasonable are. I think one in my basement causes me to worry, but I think, you know, underneath our sheetrock, we've probably got quite a few in there. I know part of that's natural, but...
You're correct. My interpretation would be the reasonable standard first applies to the building official so that it isn't just minutia. It is significant in terms of structural or safety. Then secondly, outside of that particular section, we have a provision that defers to a licensed professional. So if you as the homeowner are cited by the city for cracks in your foundation wall, prior to an appeal process, you only need one. It would not necessarily be dueling opinions or differing opinions. If you had a licensed technical professional provide an opinion, that would be acceptable.
With that in mind, what sort of, it gets beyond that, I mean, what if we have a bunch of these guys, I mean, I don't know what their license risk is when they go along and say, no, it's fine. For a fee, they'll say that. I mean, I would assume, yeah, that it's something, but maybe just for...
That's been a significant conversation in theory and policy since I've been with the city, and we've taken the approach that your license and your liability and your credibility are on the line if you're stamping that.
Okay.
Your license will
I mean, I would think so, too.
Anybody would be
Yeah.
hard-pressed to find a structural engineer that would look at it and say, given the hydraulics of soil-water mixture behind there compared to straight soil, and not having a groundwater test and not knowing the composition of the soil, I couldn't really tell you whether I'm bothered by that or not. And so I don't know whether this is just an issue that stands when we have a home that's in considerable disrepair, is brought to us after non-compliance for demolition, and the foundation shows concern of safety,
Right.
Or if this is something that can just fall its way into other things about the house.
Yeah, one thing, Commissioners, when you look at that, of course, this is not the dangerous structure side. This is just property maintenance.
Right.
But then when you read that, when it talks about shall be maintained reasonably plumb and reasonably free from open cracks and breaks, and then the sentence alludes to, it says, shall be kept in such condition so as to prevent the entry of rodents and other pests. So I look at that and I say, I think we're talking about a pretty large open crack, a pretty large break in that scenario. It's not talking about a minutia size type situation. That's the way I read it, because it's a foundation wall issue, and if it has to tell us, such condition so as to prevent the entry of rodents and other pests, there's a reason for that one. That's a pretty interesting, quite honestly, guideline in there.
So
And
then,
it tells me it's probably
then the
emphasizing
remedy
property
for that, if it's just a cracking issue, would be the homeowner would go out and get a lot of caulking and then call back the city and say the cracks are caulked.
Well, in subcommittee, we talked about expanding foam. If
Yeah.
it's not a structural issue, if it's a rodent and pest issue, then you could seal the crack.
Okay.
Did you want to have?
I think we turn it
Yeah.
over to Mr. Benston if everybody is,
Thank you.
okay. Thank you.
This looks painful. This looks painful. It's thick.
I'd take one too, Greg,
Yourself, yeah.
if I could get one also.
I'll just deploy on my part to disassociate myself from the volume of Mr. Sprague's report.
The feeling's mutual.
The procedural aspects of all of this, I think the key components that this model represents a change in one basic respect, and I think that's mainly why we wanted to take you through it. Right now, and as you consider the ordinance, you're obviously in a legislative role. There are certain state law requirements and certain due process requirements that once you take that action, if you choose to take the action, you obviously then have staff in an administrative role in implementing what you've legislated. In the course of that, and the due process considerations, along with some certain requirements that are dictated by state law, you will have some circumstances where someone, some body, has to serve in a quasi-judicial role in the course of the proceeding, whether that is in just the case of a hearing that state law requires that you give in certain circumstances, or appeals from interpretations by staff as staff would work to implement what you have enacted legislatively. Mixed in with that, we have a situation where one of your options of remedying the problem, if the property owner does not, is for the city to undertake abatement procedures. And anytime you're going on property to initiate abatement processes, that has implications as well as expense and recovery of expense. So I will try to go through this as quickly as I would expect you to wish, but trying to keep in mind what role is represented, what's occurring at each step of the way. For instance, if you look at that first page, you'll see pretty standard sort of thing. You've got unlawful acts, you've got a notice of violation, you've got an order for abatement. State law dictates a presumption in the case of a nuisance as to that being a 10-day requirement. State law also dictates what's under that next section that speaks of the ability to request a hearing. So there's our first example of being in that role where if someone objects or has a concern based on a notice that they received, they can request that hearing. The question is, who conducts that hearing? To this point, that delegation has been made to an administrative, a staff role. This model proposes that that would be, that hearing would be conducted by a building advisory board appeal panel. We speak of a panel because the proposal is that a 3-member sub-panel, if you will, of the Building Advisory Board would be appointed by the chair to hear a particular, in this case, a request for a hearing. We'll see in other contexts, just in the case of appeals in general, that would be the same model. Now, maybe at this point I need to distinguish, when we speak of appeals, we are speaking of largely appeals on matters of interpretation. We are not speaking about, and also mixed in, we have the potential for municipal court prosecution in the case of violations. You'll see that as well. Appeals from those municipal court violations go to, or if there would be a conviction and an appeal, those would go to the district court. So we need to keep those those distinctions in mind. Generally, you'll hear us speak of appeals, and that will be interpretive matters being appealed to this subpanel of the Building Advisory Board. The first example, again, this request for a hearing, this suggested model would take that to that subpanel of the Board of Appeals, or the Building Advisory Board. Another thing to note under the current approach, if you look at that last sentence on the middle of the page under the section headed Request for Hearing, you'll see that it says the decision of the Building Advisory Board appeal panel shall be the final order of the city. When we use that terminology, that final order language, it means that it is the final order of the city. It's not appealable to the City Commission. It's not appealable to anyone else that is a representative of the city. It is the city's final order, and as a result, by state law, the jurisdictional statutes for the district court, it is appealable to the district court. So we're taking this a little slowly, but it's, I think, even when we're this far in, it represents a fairly key question for you all. Now, I should say that it works. We're speaking about an allocation of responsibilities. And you could set up a system where you sit as the appeal body. Now, you can argue different ways as to the best approach. You all obviously remain in your ultimate legislative role, and if there is an interpretation by the panel or on appeal, even by a court, just like any legislative body, if you wish to clarify that, change it, or do whatever, on any given Monday, or 2 Mondays, you're in a position to do that. So that's the thought. You're on the legislative side, and that's, under this model, that's where you stay. Anything else that occurs in a quasi-judicial role is conducted by either the panel or through the court system. Now, that's not to say that that's the way it has to be. There are variations in that model. But just so that you know, this proposed model makes that allocation of responsibilities. Any questions about that? Okay. We move on pretty quickly. As you can see, the rest speaks about how the notices are served, the prospect of abatement of the nuisance by the city, how that all occurs, or actually the abatement of any number of violations. The potential penalties, those are fairly standard as well. So the balance of that section is what you might anticipate in terms of a normal enforcement scenario. Now, these are organized in the same way as the articles are in what you've looked at in terms of the substantive provisions. If you turn the page past the section that dealt with the general violations, and that would include anything that's under the property maintenance code aspects of the changes that you would be making, you'll see a heading Article 6, Dangerous Structures, Equipment, or premises. That comes next because you might recall that the two intervening articles, as you looked at the substance, were structures damaged by fire, explosion, or windstorm. That's when, as a matter, again, of state law, the city receives certain insurance proceeds to either be distributed or held in the event that the city had to initiate a dangerous structures process under state law. So that section is not really affected by a particular procedural aspect in and of itself, but it is dependent upon the dangerous structures process. Likewise, with what is Article 5, and that is the toxic chemical remediation provision, and that again is relevant in that it potentially leads, if necessary, to this dangerous structures process. So if you look there at what is identified as Article 6, dangerous structures, equipment, or premises, when you look at the first section, as it speaks of enforcement authority and procedures, that does not represent a change. It is simply an articulation of what is your authority under state law in terms of those situations where you're either leading to the repair or removal or rehabilitation of dangerous structures or the rehabilitation of abandoned property. That process does involve you directly. It's dictated by state law, and as you probably recall from your fairly recent case, involved mainly just the matter of getting the building official's opinion before you, a hearing, and your confirmation if in fact the property is a dangerous structure, and that begins the process toward either repair or demolition. What is new and is a product of the property maintenance code are some emergency measures that you see articulated there that come under the general authorization of state law but are more specific than state law in terms of what can be done on an emergency basis, of course, in the interest of health and safety. So in the dangerous structures category, no change in substance or process as you deal with dangerous structures. Some elaboration in the substance, as I'm sure you recall, under the newer provisions as to what all can be under that category of dangerous structures, but the addition of the emergency measures as well. Any questions about that? Okay. The next, Article 7, you'll see reference to sidewalks and driveway approaches. Those are sidewalks, driveway approaches, and recessed parking that occur in the right-of-way, but where we, as a matter of code, and it's generally a function of state law as well, allocate responsibility for those areas to the property owner, generally the adjoining property owner that has the benefit of either that recessed parking, that public, that sidewalk that is in the public right-of-way, or that segment of one's driveway that is between the sidewalk and what we think of as the curb line. Most of the changes there are generally making that transition. Heretofore, you all heard appeals. If someone appealed a determination or an interpretation by staff as to whether or not a particular segment of any of those improvements had to be repaired or replaced. This model, again, looks to that Building Advisory Board appeal panel as the body that would hear any appeals in that situation. Okay? We'll pick up a little steam here for you. So as you look to the next section, Weeds has its own section. Weeds is a little faster process. Weeds has the option of a one-time yearly notice that, of course, comes in handy in that drill. Does have some unique aspects, but that's the essence of it. in terms of any distinctions from the general process. Again, there is by statute a right to a request for a hearing, and you can see there again that we've made provision that it would be that Building Advisory Board appeal panel that would hear the hearing on Commissioner Angel's tomato plants.
Come over with a tape measure later.
If you move on through that, you'll then go to what's identified as Article 9, inoperable vehicles. Sometimes the most complex procedurally, but the shortest in that it's basically an incorporation by reference to the process for the general violations. You do see in red the insertion there of, again, what is a reference to state law. It's complicated enough if you're having to abate those disabled or inoperable vehicles. It is even a more complex process once you pick it up and put it down and have to follow the state law process in order to deal with title and disposition and all of that. But thus the reference, really just the incorporation by reference to the state law process. That then takes us to Article 10, which is the more detailed description of that appeal process, how those panels are made up, how they are appointed by the chairman, how they are not compensated, how they convene, how quickly they must meet. Their hearings are subject to the Open Meetings Act. The Buildings Advisory Board is enabled to enact procedures related to those panels. If an appeal is invoked, as you might imagine, that does stay the enforcement process until that can be addressed. We reinforce the concept there in the next to last section, 111.7, on the limited scope of that appeal. And again, make the point that in general, appeals to those panels are a final order of the city and would be subject to appeal to the district court and not back to the city commission.
If I could add one clarification, one change from current practice in this proposed approach with respect to weeds is currently state statute provides for out of non-resident non-owner occupied properties are supposed to be advertised in the paper for 10 days. We've practically never really seen that be effective. The state statute also provides for a local adoption of a local process. So what's prescribed in this proposal is 5 days notice for a resident or a local owner, 10 days notice for a non-resident, non-local owner, and then also posting on the city's website in lieu of publication in the local paper.
Okay. Questions of Mr. Bingston or?
Just one last point, I suppose. Certainly trying to go through some of that in that degree of detail on process was certainly not to tell you all how it should be, but to go through that so that we can be sure we are doing it the way you wish, or if you prefer otherwise, we obviously make it the way you wish.
Does enforcement need to accompany the ordinance changes? I would think so,
I believe
right?
some of it may exist in state statute, but not all of it, and so it would be difficult to adopt the prohibitions without enforcement.
Well, I mean, through the commission. Yeah, I mean, the enforcement is a certain part of the policy, and that wasn't really discussed heavily in study sessions, and so. And so there may be issues and comments and questions that lead to another draft, and some of it does tie in to the overall changes. And what I mean by that, to be clear, is I understand the model of the final authority, final order of the city coming from an appeals committee, the Building Advisory Board. But I also know a lot of the wrestling that the commission did with some of these things, and we know that we're going to have situations of, well, we didn't think of that. We didn't think of city use and private use like we talked about on the parking earlier. We would assume that there's no action, but we can't guarantee that there's just going to be all that grace utilized while it's worked out. This, to me, removes the appeals and the final authority from the body that had to try to wrestle through it and knows that there are still uncomforts and things that are going to have to be worked out in some of the subjective terms and things that then wouldn't be appealed to this body. And so that's one of the things that seems like a shift. I can understand it, but I know in the back page, Mr. Bingston, very last page, under limitations on authority, this panel shall have no authority to waive requirements of any code duly adopted or amended by this chapter. What does that mean?
That language is to assure that this panel would not take it upon itself to become, I guess you could say, almost a board of variance. Their job is to interpret, or is to address questions of interpretation, but their job is not to say, well, we don't think you should have to do that, so you don't have to do that.
And that, to me, I that's what the way that I read it. To me, it seems like in the step forward of the things that are of the good tone, for the reason of the whole property maintenance code. To me, then, it seems a little bit counterproductive, because it seems like some of those initial appeals are going to be in a request somewhat for a variance for situations that weren't digested, thought of, that are new, so they wouldn't have that authority. I would feel that for the initial period, even if the final order came from the commission, that there was a subsequent appeal that could go in front of the city commission, that the commission is still then standing in front of the citizens, that and the commission knowing what the heart and the tone of the ordinance was to begin with, or the changes was to begin with, is then that final appeal. It seems like once these bumps are worked out and all this is discovered, I think this would be the exactly right thing, because you would know that everything that was written in here is the gospel of that what you wanted to have implemented by the cities, and there wouldn't be any reason for variances. It would be more of a procedural appeal.
If it's useful at all, the Building Advisory Board faces a similar scenario somewhat frequently, recognizing the building codes are a little bit more solidified in terms of the expectations. But currently, as we deal with someone that's making an appeal to the Building Advisory Board, one of the first things we have to ascertain is, are they truly wanting a variance, or is it an interpretive issue? And so if it's interpretive, it's as Mr. Bankson described. If it's an issue with the requirement itself, they have an opportunity to request a text amendment, where they then can suggest that we need to consider a different requirement altogether. But the expectation is that that's going to be a text amendment that's universally applicable, not an isolated exception granted for an isolated case.
Okay. And this body, it would be the body the weeds are kind of easy because we can all understand that. I can. This would be the body that appeal on weeds would go to, right?
The Building Advisory Board panel? Yes.
Yep. So let me throw the scenario out, that the tall grass area behind a lot of our homes that I described, a lot of them have wildflowers scattered throughout. How is that going to be, how would it be heard? Because on the surface, it's a tall grass complaint. And anybody looking across somebody's chain link, most of our areas would, but across somebody's chain link would say, hey, there's new ordinance and y'all got to go mow that down. Well, that's not what I invested in and put in. The flowers aren't out, so you can't tell it's an intentional thing. How's that appeal handled without the ability for a variance in that situation that says, you're right?
Well, I think the staff's assistance would be to provide the definition of weeds and help them understand the code as it's written. And so I think the question would turn on whether it's a cultivated garden, whether it meets the exceptions from the weeds definition such that it doesn't have to be mowed. If the outcome is we don't agree with the approach in the code, then we'd be talking about a text amendment.
And see, I guess I understand that what we're trying to do is eliminate those that let their grass grow up 3 feet tall and have every rodent living in it, and they're a bad neighbor, and they're not contributing to the community. I really understand that, but on a viable consideration of what somebody did, it was maybe cultivated 20 years ago when they put it in, but you wouldn't call it a garden or those things. There needs to be that body that's going to say, okay, I've looked at those pictures. We even sent somebody out there to look around it, and we see that is a proper thing.
Let me ask a question, if I can. The scenario that the mayor's is discussing, I'm presuming today would be a nuisance if called upon?
Yes.
Okay. So doesn't mean that it shouldn't be looked at. I just want to try to put it the same picture to mainstream it. It would today, under the current code, be a nuisance. Whether it should or not, I think, is a very good question. If you put yourself in the position of taking variances, you're going to have a long list, I have a feeling, especially if you're dealing with weeds, possibly some inoperable vehicles. I would say some property maintenance. So a lot of it has to do with the size of the organization, and at this point, anticipation of the volume, because we really don't know how many we're going to have. But if it's a significant volume, you're going to fill your agenda up with those requests. So I think part of the thinking is with the size of organization of having a 3-person group that can be pulled from a larger group, so it doesn't weigh down a single entity or single committee, city commission agenda. That was part of it too. And I don't know if there's any thought as far as the role on that, but that was part of it. And like I said, you could go a lot of different directions. A variance, if you take yourself beyond an interpretive situation into a variance situation, I think you will probably increase demand for that request. So I think if there are a couple concerns on the application, such as what you're talking about in some kind of a natural vegetative situation, we probably need to rethink that definition and deal with it on the front end.
I tend to think that I definitely understand where the mayor's coming from, that it's kind of a living document that we sort of want to hone it down. It's a big step for us. But I definitely can appreciate that we would have a commission meeting full of people wanting variances and things. So I still feel like this is maybe the best approach. I have this feeling that if there's some issues in our code, it'll rise to the top. We're going to hear about them if there's something that because it's probably going to affect one of us somehow. There's 5 of us up here. If there's something that's maybe we didn't think out quite as well, and it can happen both ways. The side yard thing, maybe we only did the front yards, but neighbors started saying, hey, my neighbor's parking in the side yard. I think there'll be opportunities for us to amend this document and make it more, comprehensive or less, depending on what feedback we get. If there's issues with this flower thing, or if we hear enough of it, I still feel like maybe this approach is the best, because I think we just have appeal after appeal after appeal after appeal, and that would become our job, and we wouldn't get the business of the city done. I think we'd be turning ourselves into interpreters of code enforcement, which the whole idea of this is to remove us as much from this as we can and let you guys go out and do your job, I think.
couple of thoughts that occur to me, and recognizing the concern the mayor's raising. One possibility is providing regular reports on the appeals that have been received, the nature of the appeal, and the outcome, so that you have some ongoing status report in terms of the issues that are coming up. Another possibility could be that a request for a text amendment could amount to a stay of enforcement until the text amendment's processed. I don't know in terms of volume. What that may do is any person that's wishing to appeal is going to file an appeal and a text amendment. You may still see the same volume, but if it's an issue of the appropriateness of the requirement, that would be the opportunity to address it.
I like the aspect of the reporting. I think that lets us be aware if we keep seeing something crop up, something seems out of line, then at least appears to us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think one thing, too, Commissioners, if we, as a staff, if our people see something that we think it was not anticipated, we have an obligation to hold that back and say, hold on a second, before we move forward with enforcement, let's put that out in front of you and ask you if you want to consider some type of legislative amendment and deal with that issue. Mm-hmm. And that's something we'll have to actively do, but I think we're obligated to do that.
Mm-hmm. I think there needs to be some discretion on the part of, the building official or whoever is going to be in charge of this. And if we allow those variances, it's going to go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And the grass will never get mowed. That's the way I feel, so.
Yeah.
And I suppose grass and weeds was a bad example because that's already
That's it, obviously.
That's already there.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not adding anything new
Yeah.
there, relatively speaking.
I think it's a very appropriate example, just from what we experience.
Well, yeah, but we didn't pick this up to talk about weeds. We
No.
picked this up to talk about how we don't like the looks of other people's houses and how we don't like the way they park in their yards and those types of things that bother some people. That's why it was picked up. So the weeds has always been there. We've always had a mechanization to tell people your weeds are out of control, and then annually we hear the amounts that we assess against for mowing their yards for them, and we go about it. And so I guess that's always been there. It's the other areas that are new. Any other questions of staff? Open it up for public comment. Anybody that would like to comment on this item? Please state your name and address for the record. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is John Mars, 2035 East Iron. I'm the chairman of the Building Advisory Board, and as it's been reported, we've spent quite a bit of time reviewing this. I would say that having sat in your position, this may go down as your legacy as far as what you're doing, but I applaud you for taking this action because I think the nuisance ordinance that we currently have only reacts to events that happen, and they continue to happen over and over again. So how this is enforced and how this is dealt with, I think you're right. We're going to see things that need to be done. I think it's important that there be a process for text amendments so that we can address those issues as they go. Our city is very good about enforcing ordinances that are on the book. Looking the other way is not one of the things that city enforcement is known for. If it's there, they typically report it, and then you go through the procedures. And I think you have to have procedures that allow you to make amendments, especially when you're going to make the kind of changes that you're making here. A broad across-the-board change in how all of this is done. Staffing the enforcement of this will probably slow its enforcement down because I'm not sure that you're going to fund, you said this was a neutral funding issue, so you're really not looking at adding people to fund this or to enforce it. It was my suggestion that the city try it on their own properties first to see what issues might be out there that really should be fixed first before it's applied to the entire public. And as I was talking to Mike on the phone this morning, I'd walk past Lakewood Park and in fact, okay, we've got this wildlife area here that's really intended to be a wildlife area. I have a neighbor who has a tall grass area in his yard. He used to mow it. He's right across the street from Marymount. He used to burn it even and get a burn permit. He doesn't do that anymore. It still grows up, but it's what he considers a wildlife preserve, and he has a lot of birds and a lot of animals and stuff that live in that. He's in violation of this ordinance if you don't have some way of getting those areas allowed to exist. I think Mike mentioned that there are some cities that have adopted this that have a process where you can apply for an exemption for a specific area, where you bring a picture of it in, you show what you're doing, you show that it is this wildlife or this natural tall grass area that you are maintaining appropriately as wildflowers or tall grass. That may be a suggestion that you consider. But the appeals process, we'll find out how much of an issue that will be. We do have people that are constantly involved in this whole nuisance ordinance violations, and we'll see how that works. But all in all, I think it's a great start, and I think it just needs to have the ability to be able to put in place and then be able to be changed as changes need to be taken place without penalizing the people that are being called for a violation that ultimately ends up becoming a change. So however you can do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have other public comment? Mr. Sprague, on the attached Appendix A that came from that really highlights all of the modifications through struck through blue, red, struck through red. There's a couple of highlighted areas, I think, that just call for the amount of fines. When you move past there into each article, each article then is only modified exactly as shown?
Correct.
Through the Appendix A?
Yes. Any modifications that are not representative of Appendix A are shown as red lines in the ordinance that you've received.
Under recodification or anything, there's not any entirety sections that are added or anything like that.
Well, with the exception of that list and the item where we're taking, for example, Article 5 of Chapter 8 and making it Article 4 of Chapter 31.
But it's essentially moving, but there's no changes other than those changes that are represented earlier in the document in the appendix as a modification.
That's correct. We made our best effort to start with the red line version that came out of the Building Advisory Board as the starting point, and then anything that was a modification from that we tried to show as a red line.
Okay. In the entirety of Article 6, dangerous structures only applies to those structures that have been duly deemed a dangerous structure, right? I mean, they don't have a leak through to a non-dangerous structure.
Correct. In fact, the Property Maintenance Code had references to unsafe and dangerous that were somewhat interchangeable, and we tried to clarify for the purpose of the dangerous structure process imminent life, health, safety, failure, collapse type items.
I think it would be helpful, if not just to myself. Now that we've gone through the depth of the nuts and bolts, I think those listening, it might be good just to have a broad brush. And by that, you've done a very good job of arranging the section, and we talked about the depth in the section, but when we got to talking about the weeds, it's really existing and it falls within.
Certainly.
This gives us a handling mechanism. So it's a very thick packet with a lot of change, but it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of headings that it affects or a whole lot of areas that it affects.
Well, I'm a little surprised you're asking for more of a report, but I'd be happy to do that.
Say that again?
After all of this.
I certainly can take it article by article and give you a brief overview of each.
Yeah.
Article 1, definitions. The bulk of those definitions come from the Property Maintenance Code. We did pick up the definition of perennial violator from our current code, and we previously discussed some of the definitions that we felt we needed to fill in, such as good working order and workmanlike, and those haven't changed since you saw them last, but we tried to provide clarification of those. In Article 2, the general application and scope, that is where the bulk of the Property Maintenance Code requirements were inserted. We talked about historic buildings as a topic. As you go through that section, there's the general language that comes from the Property Maintenance Code, but is very similar to our current language as it relates to general duties, inspections, rights of inspection, right of entry, things like that. There's also language that is identical with the building code as it relates to.
So I might be able to save you.
Okay.
What I was actually looking for is when we hit Article 2, you could say the only section affected was historical buildings for this purpose.
Okay.
Is that?
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. In Article 2 on historic buildings, the additional revision that was made was just to further clarify the subcommittee's intent about continued maintenance of a condition would be safe, so that if we're talking about preserving a historic element, it just solidifies the expectation of continued safety. The next revision that I'm aware of is in workmanship in Section 31.76. And I believe that's just a removal of a formatting extra line. If you go to Article 3, Section 31.101.1, that insertion in red is picking up the current code language as it relates to nuisances, just to be sure that we're clear on everything from carcasses to animal waste to odors and stenches and rank sewage and none of those items.
Down refrigerators and all of those things that are there now. Yeah.
Items 1 through 9 are currently in Chapter 24 of our code.
Right.
Exterior sidewalks, I think the edit was the insertion of private. As Mr. Bankston described, statutorily, the public sidewalks are regulated. The Property Maintenance Code contemplates sidewalks within the private property outside of the right-of-way, so we inserted the term private. If I'm missing any, feel free to stop me. Working through the bulk of the Property Maintenance Code, water, storm, there aren't any changes in those provisions. Boarding standard, Section 31.130.1. We recognize that the Property Maintenance Code, as it was written, said that all windows and doors must be boarded. It failed to make the distinction of unsecured windows and doors, so we took the liberty of inserting that.
Okay.
In the Article 4, structures damaged by fire, there are some revisions from Mr. Bankston to further clarify what's the current approach as it relates to insurance claims and payments in reference to the insurance policy, as well as some grammatical changes in paragraph A. In 31303E, the revision struck the upon notification to the director of the director of finance, and reworded it such that the director of finance shall pay all such monies within 30 days after receipt of such monies, unless the city has instituted legal proceedings. So it puts the burden on us, it appears. In the next paragraph, there were changes in the section references to correspond with what the changes that we're making. And there was an insertion of all monies in excess of that which is ultimately necessary to comply with the provisions for repair, and the insertion of or removal of the building. In the toxic chemical remediation, the section 31403 subsection C, we removed the reference to the uniform code for the abatement of dangerous structures, since we're striking that from our current codes and relying on the property maintenance code. I believe we did that a second time in section 31409. And so that paragraph was reworded such that the city may condemn the building and either remediate the contamination or demolish the building in the same manner as a dangerous structure pursuant to Article 6, and reworded that such that it was a little bit clearer on what the options were, and removed the reference to the Uniform Code for abatement of dangerous structures. In section Article 4, Division 1, and that's where I mentioned we removed references to unsafe and made them references to dangerous. So you'll see quite a few deletions of unsafe and insertion of dangerous. Section 31502.1 is picking up the language in its entirety within the property maintenance code and just inserting it under the heading of dangerous structures, so the two flow together rather than have that dangerous structures or premises language later in the code. We felt like that was a more logical progression of the requirements than what was in the property maintenance code. I think the rest of that is deletion of unsafe and insertion of dangerous structures. In Article 7, sidewalks and driveway approaches, we struck and inserted or, so that it reads every sidewalk, driveway approach, or recessed parking area, rather than making that all-inclusive. In Article 8 on weeds, Division 1, we added the exceptions that I previously discussed. So exceptions 1 and 2 are additions. In Article 9, inoperable vehicles, we added those exceptions as well, so that the language about a vehicle being able to undergo major overhaul, including body work, was already in, but it was not formatted that way as an exception. And then the second item, the immediate repair of a vehicle serving an occupant's sole source, serving as an occupant's sole source of vehicular transportation, but such repair activity, interrupted or not, shall not extend beyond 2 consecutive calendar days, was staff's attempt to create the relief for the scenario we described, where a person needs to make a repair to their vehicle to get to work. And that is it as it relates to Chapter 31. The other ordinances are as they were described in the item in terms of deleting chapters and replacing them. And then the last ordinance, yard parking, is as we discussed as well. And as it relates to that ordinance, the new insertions are in Section 85, items 13 and 14.
I thank you for that. I hope that was helpful to somebody other than myself, and maybe those that are listening in as well. Are there any items, any further questions?
This may be for Mr. Bangston on 31-52.3. Talks about entry of the code official. And it says if entry is refused by the person living in the home, the code official shall have recourse to the remedies provided by law to secure entry. You might explain what those remedies would be?
Certainly, anytime any city staff personnel are faced with that circumstance, we, without the consent of the property owner, we have available to us an administrative search warrant to be sought from and issued by the district court, and that is the means that we usually utilize in that situation.
And does there have to be some kind of reasonable, what's the, you know, what the standard is for getting the search warrant issued?
Well, it is basically a probable cause sort of test that, yes, we do have to show by affidavit that we have reason to believe, based on probable cause, that there is a violation, and it's a matter of
Getting entry to the dwelling to verify. Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
You don't have to do that very often, fortunately, but it is available if necessary.
Any other questions of staff or further discussion?
No?
I think the only thing I'd like to add before we take it to a vote is I do see problematic things with it, and if it passes, I think it will be a step towards helping things within the community. When I think about 90 days, I wish that there was a variance capability, because I think some people 90 days might not be an actable amount of time in order to do the things that they need to do. I know it seems like a long time, but sitting in this chair to do some of the things that we need to do, 90 days is often a very, very short time. If something has to get done, a loan has to be procured, or somebody has to get permission from an estate to junk 100 cars or something. I don't know whether 90 would cut it. I know we have to have a number, though. And then I just hope that all the way through the city there's understanding and as it is implemented. I guess I go back to there are quite a few places in town that are eyesores with a lot of cars laying around, and there's quite a few places that claim that as part of they were already there. There's one that had quite a few cars that were parked for their trust, so they said, and small trees and things grew up around it, and I think they ended up getting rid of them on behalf of the trust. But an action like that wouldn't happen very quick, and it's somebody that's had an existing practice for quite a while.
If it helps at all, with the exception of compliance deadlines that are specified by statute, the property maintenance code in this chapter, the only deadline that it imposes is a reasonable deadline to be established by the building official. So our expectation in terms of implementation would be the requirements would be in effect in 90 days, but at the point that we identify a violation, we still would have to provide them a reasonable deadline that gives them the opportunity to make the repairs.
Yeah, Commissioners.
Now, we're not able to anticipate all those issues, but our practice has been, if we can see reasonable forward progress, we'll try to document that and work with them. But it becomes an issue of if it gets strung out and whether it's continuous or whether we're stalling out, that type of thing.
The other aspect of that is our municipal court is very, very busy right now, and our objective is not to add a tremendous amount of court volume because of this. that wouldn't serve us very well. So Mike's correct. I mean, in the end, we just want it cleaned up, and if someone can show that they're making the progress, that's what we're going to look for.
One other question for clarification, then I think I'm done. The way this parking ordinance stands now, without any changes, all those folks that come in from out of town that park in that grassy lot at the Bicentennial Center that are going to the River Festival could come out and all have citations on their windshields when they get out.
As
Correct?
it's written, that would be correct.
Okay.
Now, at the point that we get to item number 3, there are a handful of finalization items that I'd like to summarize for you, and that could very well be one of them. If you wish to create a special permit process, we could do that between first and second reading.
The other issue that you might, again, that was discussed, it may be of importance too, is this, and I don't know if we can come up with a good solution, but this idea of a natural vegetative area. We do address it for schools and governmentally owned property. We don't address it for the private property. If that's important enough for you, that's something we could spend some time on between first and second reading as well.
I think it would be. I know that Parks and Rec is doing a lot on Indian Rock. I know that part of the cell tower hearing that went on, or determination that went on the part of the city commission, raised what part of that is intentional and unintentional maintenance, because it grows up and we burn it, and there's dirt piled up and things that are just kind of piled within a park that are in visual access all the way around. And I think it does send the wrong message to those that can look and say, well, there's just piles of dirt here and things there, and not really understand what you're doing in a park or an area like that. So I think being able to do something in that area would be of benefit. But I understand it has to be done in a way that the person with dandelions, milkweed, ragweed, and tall grass is not a natural weed preserve.
Well, and again, it may be, that's true, and it may be a situation though where we build in discretion based on certain factors to designate and say that area it meets the criteria, and we designate that, and therefore we won't bug you anymore. I think that's possible. Again, some other communities have looked at that. I think we can take a peek. We have looked at their approach some. So if that's important to you as a commission, I think we can figure that out.
And then I suppose, Mr. Schrag, when we get there and we talk about some of the implementation items, if we're talking about parking, what strikes me when you say special permit is somebody's got to come down, somebody's got to fill it out, maybe now somebody's got a fee, and that's pretty easy when it's the city function, because we just walk across the hall and we fill it out and have it done. But for that person that's monthly got something going on that routinely happens or right now, and then they're going to be ceased on those type of things.
I'm just thinking of even St. Mary's and Sacred Heart. Christmas Mass, they park in that grassy lot right there between the two schools. If there's a basketball game, they're parking
Kansas
there.
Wesleyan.
If there's a carnival, they're parking there. If there's a Christmas program, singing program, they'd be in here once a month trying to get a special permit to park in that lot.
And I understand your point. From an implementation standpoint, the first thing the staff's going to have to do is recognize when a citation is going to catch someone by surprise, and had that initial conversation with the property owner versus just write a citation for an unsuspecting person that's there for the carnival. I don't know. I don't have an easy answer in terms of how you get around
I don't know what you do
the
either.
permit process altogether. But I think we could create a permit that tries to anticipate not just one event, but isolated recurring
overflow.
Can it be worded under the discretion of the city manager with a reasonable assumption that there was a special event conducted? I mean, and that maybe keeps it out of having to apply for it. And if it's a big auction on Broadway on that Saturday, if it's Kansas Wesleyan football game or the soccer complexes, that parking lot gets full, so there are people that park up by the building. and across the street in that other area by the dike. So I think it's some of those kind of things that if there's wording and the future commission desires to have the city manager just know that those things occurred at discretion, then that's, I think, the lenience that you're looking for.
And I understand the point. I think what I'd like to do is try to make an effort to bring something back to you between first and second reading. The one thing that I would tell you is when you start getting into a commercial application, I anticipate that we'll run into the inequity of I've got to pave and they don't, but our current zoning regulations provide for grandfathering of unsurfaced parking. And so if we can deal with the document the non-conforming situation and let it run its course for the auction scenario, that probably works versus create a special permit for a commercial, ongoing commercial.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with that one. Yeah, I'm really uncomfortable with that because that's a for-profit, and value of property, especially commercial property, is based on its usability and the application of the property. And if you have somebody over there who's misusing city code, I mean, in a sense, I would not see giving a variance for something like that. I could see it at a school event or something like that. I have a harder time with a commercial event because or a commercial situation because you're basically, it's no different than having a really crummy rental house with bad parking. You're going to get less rent because it's less desirable. People have to park in a further away area and walk to it. That sets the value. Well, if we allow them to illegally, so to speak, use off-site parking or grass parking or things like that, then he has an unfair advantage with his commercial property that other commercial properties who have gone through the process, paved it, and built up their property. I would have a real hard time with that coming back before me and accepting that as
Yeah, I think you can make the distinction between intermittent special events and long-term commercial use, and the long-term use can be dealt with as a nonconformity. If it's occurring today, we can deal with it as a nonconformity as long as it doesn't expand or discontinue. So I think we can probably balance all those interests.
Yeah, and in my example, it was me that parked in an area that wasn't described by the commercial property owner.
Right.
I'm not thinking about that commercial property owner. I'm thinking about the citizen that parked here to go to an event here, and they come back and they get a ticket, and they're like, there was already cars parking here, there wasn't a no parking sign, there wasn't something from the business that says free parking here. You just parked there and you got hammered with a ticket. That's not good treatment of citizens, and that's what I'm trying to that's what I'm trying to get.
And I can understand that, but I would also think it'd be up to the commercial owner's responsibility that has these events to let people know, hey, you can't park here too. And it brings up a whole other issue on that, which maybe we can address after the meeting. But I thought some of that area they were parking was city property over there that was being utilized, and now didn't we convey that back to the National Guard? Isn't that kind of where that auction house is parking over there?
Yeah, that could be. We'll have to check on that.
I was just curious. That opened up the whole can of worms when you brought that up as an example. It just made me think of numerous bad things going on.
I think if we can give you 70 pages about the rest of it, we can probably fix those two things for you.
Sure.
So let us work on that for second reading. I think we can do that.
We're going to go ahead and take a couple-minute break. As commission, we'll come back because I don't want to prompt a rapid vote, so that there's time for discussion, and maybe very will be no further discussion. But we're going to go ahead and take a few-minute break and then return here at 6:55.
Oh, perfect. Good job.
Saw the shot live and has a ticket for the game tonight if he's feeling up.
So it's not just about the dress, but
Return to our regularly scheduled meeting. To point on item 8.5, where I ask if there's further discussion, further questions. It seems to me on the surface, Mr. Schrag, you'd be the one to tell me if I'm wrong. But along the way, a lot of the discussion was, window glazing and trim that was unaffixed to house, or even peeling and cracking paint and some of those things. Those are not a part of this. We're dealing with weeds and parking, how we deal with dangerous structures. It seems to be that
There is a property maintenance component to it, but it is not at the level of detail that the International Property Maintenance Code started out as a result of the conversations we've had in study session. We've backed it up to more structural, imminent danger,
Right.
blight, property maintenance in terms of just the highlights of what's necessary to maintain a property as a starting point. And then the other thing that we did was try to clarify anything that might be cause for confusion, back out staff discretion, and insert a reasonableness standard wherever
And what section deals with the property maintenance issues that are non-danger structures?
Article 3. I'm sorry, Article 2. I apologize, it is 3. Article 3, general, the substantive requirements get into exterior property areas, swimming pools, exterior structures, interior structures.
But those are not changed.
No, they're not changed. That is what we're picking up from the property maintenance code that is not currently as part of our code.
So they'd all be red.
Well, they would
Because they're all new.
Yes, they're all new to our code. They have not been changed from the draft that you saw in study session that we took to the Building Advisory Board, and the only changes that were made from the Building Advisory Board were reflected in those two documents that were provided entitled Building Advisory Board Recommendations and Building Advisory Board Revision Notes. So, I'm sorry, when you asked me that question before, I thought we were talking about changes from the draft that came out of study session.
But even like section 31-127.3, that's not really a structural thing. That's saying you can't have a keyed deadbolt, which is one of the things I highlighted, because we have safety experts telling us you want to have a keyed deadbolt for safety reasons, but then locked doors say you can't have a keyed deadbolt.
Right, yeah. As I said, we tried to go through the property maintenance code and pull out anything that was too high of a level of detail. The locked doors is probably good. There are fire safety standards and there are some structural security standards. We lessened the standards as it relates to securing doors and windows to just have a kind of a broad statement about security versus going into the level of detail that the International Property Maintenance Code does.
And then like the 31-129.4, you can't have the battery-operated smoke alarms anymore. They all have to be wired.
Yep. And as it relates to that, we tried to create exception language such that unless you are doing repairs that necessitate it and the costs are under 15%, you still have an exception.
Staff has had a very difficult task.
I would agree.
I truly appreciate all of the work that staff, Building Advisory Board, everybody that has put into this. If you look at Section 131-103.8, such a small section, roofs and drains.
Yes.
Final two sentences,
31-103.
which would read, roof drains, gutters, and downspouts shall be maintained in good working order and free of obstructions. Roof water shall not be discharged in a manner that creates a public nuisance.
Yes.
Okay, those are just the things that I'm uncomfortable about, especially when the matter goes to a board that has no discretionary ability, essentially. And to example, I know of my area is built on the side of the hill, and I know there's a few neighbors that complained about each other for a long time because one stormwater drains on the other's house. And outside of tiling and taking something out to the road and that, you know, I don't know what you do about it, but this could open up the door to say that that's public nuisance. I don't know how you handle it, and I know then it requires variance and somebody that's going to look at it and say, okay, here's what it is. I know the intent of what we've discussed in study session is the obstruction of leaves is going to be taken care of, you know, every once in a while, but the term obstruction would be like somebody jammed something in there intentionally as making it not work.
Well, and I understand your point. As you may recall, the International Property Maintenance Code uses the term good working order repeatedly, and it provides no definition. So staff developed the definition that it is maintained in such a manner that said element is capable of safely and reliably performing the intended function without need for further intervention, maintenance, or repair. So it's not perfection. It's performing the task without having to go out in a rainstorm and plunge it, or whatever the case may be. As it relates to discharging onto, causing a public nuisance, believe it or not, the plumbing code currently prohibits discharging downspouts onto adjoining property. I know that water is a
adjoining property.
I know that water is a common enemy, so we would have to deal with it that way too. But I think, well, nuisances are undefined in state statute, even though they're regulated, which has been a frustration for us. Yeah. But I think the most likely scenarios where that would cause a nuisance is if it is damaging a neighboring property, or it's causing standing water that becomes stagnant and infested and harbors mosquito larvae.
Most of those alleyways downtown are, you know, really dangerous in the wintertime because of the water that comes down off the roof and freezes, and so.
And this would give a person a right of complaint. Right there.
Probably would.
Well, I mean,
it's a public nuisance. I want the city to do something about it.
Well, I mean, but the truth of the matter is, you own property, and I mean, I think we're getting into minutia here. I think it's a good argument. I think we ought to go ahead and just get this thing passed and get on to the rest of our lives. Of course. I understand your concerns, and they're good ones. But, I mean, we're crying about people who buy property and then don't maintain it. If you have a building downtown and your water discharges, and I know the buildings you're talking about, and it builds an ice sheet back there that people are falling down on a daily basis, I'm helping them there, you've got a problem, and you need to be maintained. And I'm not here to defend those kind of people. I'm here to make those people do the proper maintenance. That most of them that maintain mortgages, their mortgage is right on the thing, that they'll do all the things that we're asking them to do. We're just giving the city the legal right to go out to the people who aren't doing those things, make our town a better-looking town, make it a safer-looking place. I mean, I appreciate that there's these fine minutiae, and I think we'll address them when they come to them, but we're throwing the baby out with the thimble of water here. These minor oddball issues, we will address them when they come up, but we're missing the entire forest for a couple of twigs out here, and they're examples that may come up, but I'd rather see the big picture than the occasional oddball thing that I think will be addressed as we grow this document and move forward. But examples of the water and things like that. You know, if you're pouring water on your neighbor and it's a problem and you can't get it together, your neighbor should have an ability to go to the city and say, hey, this guy's, making not just a wreck of my yard or whatever, he's creating a health hazard by creating standing water. So, yeah, I don't think it's as laughable as we look at some of these simple things. This has been going on for a long time in this town, and it's time that we did something about it. I think what Donnie Mars said is exactly right. This is our legacy. This is our ability to start turning our town around to a town that respects its property and respects its adjoining property owners. So, I mean, short of any other modifications for them, I'd like to get a movement on and get this thing voted on, yay or nay.
The problem is not everything in here is addressing your concerns.
Well,
there are things in here that have nothing to do with maintaining a structure. Having a deadbolt versus having a manual lock. That
Sure.
has nothing to
You
do
just
with
have to decide if you want security, if you want to burn alive in a house fire.
Or you break a glass window and get out.
I mean, if it's a solid steel door and you got a deadbolt and you can't find the key and you're at the back of the building, you got a fire, you have to, at that moment, ask yourself, was it more important to put a keyed deadbolt in there, or the ability to protect somebody from breaking in, or was the ability to get out?
Because this maintenance code requires certain window requirements, so you're going to have a window to get out of.
I mean, maybe. I mean, I just think that those little small issues that were coming up, I mean, we knew that this wasn't going to be a complete document from the get-go. I think they've done a great job with what they've got, and I think it's an excellent step forward. And I think we've mentioned a few things that we wanted to address before the second reading.
And my problem is this takes away an individual's ability to make that choice of what's more important to them. This is government coming in and saying, no, this is what you're going to do.
I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but that's what we've done since we've been elected to this position. I'm pretty sure that...
Some of us have.
Well,
some of us haven't.
I'm certainly open for any motions.
Well, I move that we adopt ordinance number 13-10688, 13-10669, 13-10692, 13-10693, and 13-10694. Do I need to mention that we would take some of the mentioned revisions by the second reading? For instance, no yard parking versus just front yard, or is that just understood? Or
if you'd like, I could try to itemize those.
I was going to suggest, I do think, Commissioner, that even though it is first reading, we do need to take them up one at a time.
One at a time?
The ordinances. I'm sorry to bring that.
No worries.
But we should do that.
I know for me personally.
I thought that might give
I know for me
opportunity to-
personally, the yard issue would be one. I think another one that was mentioned was trying to define a standard for special events or continued. Is there a better way to do that?
I'm sorry, I meant primarily that each ordinance.
Oh, it needs to be voted on separately?
Separate motion.
Oh, okay.
And I thought that might, although that will take a little longer, it might be conducive to, if there are particular points that anyone would wish to make as far as anticipated modifications on second reading, that would be the opportunity, I think.
Sure, and that one where we were looking at the parking, that's all going to be
Yeah, that's in
694?
694, yes.
Okay, so we'll just initially move that we adopt ordinance number 13-10688.
That motion dies for a lack of a second.
I move that we adopt 13-10691.
Second.
Are any of these ordinances predicated on each other?
Well,
Or
as
they
it turns
would
out,
not be able
no.
to
Some of them are, but the first one, Chapter 30.5, could remain with a decimal point numbering. 32 makes way for 31, and moving public utilities to 31 makes way for the property maintenance code. So the answer to your question is yes and no. The first one completely
First one's
stood alone.
freestanding, the rest are not.
Three go together.
We have a motion and a second to approve on first reading ordinance number 13-10691. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carried 5-0.
I move that we adopt 13-10692.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve on first reading ordinance number 13-10692. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carried 5-0.
I move that we adopt ordinance number 13-10693.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve on first reading ordinance number 13-10693. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Nay? Aye. That motion carried 3-2 with Commissioner Angel and Mayor Jennings voting nay.
I move that we adopt ordinance 13-10694, adding that before it's brought back for second reading, that we would add all yard to section 14, I believe, of 85, of Section 85, paragraph 14, we would modify that to say, is that correct?
Yeah, I think you can just strike front and just make it any yard.
Just remove the word front and make that yard. And then also have staff look at being able to modify for special events or I don't know what other wording might work in that, just special events maybe.
I think that would help us. I think that's good enough. The
Okay.
special events in their nature are temporary anyway.
Okay,
so.
temporary nature. Okay. That's my motion.
Second.
We do have a motion and a second. Is it your intention of the motion to be all yard, front to back, side to side? I know you spoke of side.
I know we
but
have-
Now you're all. I just wanted to make sure that.
I think all,
that's a
we do have some provision in there for the, well, I should specify, there is a provision if it's fenced and out of sight, isn't there?
In the zoning code?
Yes.
Yes.
There is.
And we can take that into
Yeah,
account.
I would add that's not already protected via that section of the zoning code, because I know we discussed that before, that if somebody has got it in the back and covered, or there's some other provisions in there.
So I need a little clarification.
This
from-
would simply
from
be-
staff. If you
yeah.
have an unattached garage around behind a house that somebody parks next to, then this would prohibit that. That would make that an unlawful act.
If you park an unsurfaced area, it would. If it were in an enclosed building, if it were
Right,
within
right.
fencing, it'd be legal, or if it were on a surfaced area, it would be legal.
Okay. I understand the motion is presented. We have a motion and a second to approve on first reading ordinance number 13-10694 with a modification to allow for parking prohibition in all yard and for a methodology to handle special event parking to be returned to the commission upon second reading of this ordinance. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Aye. That motion carried 4-1 with Mayor Jennings dissenting. Do we have further business? We have a request for an executive session. We need a slip.
Do we have the document?
No.
No, we need it, yeah. It's all personnel. Is that correct?
Okay.
All personnel? Okay.
I move. Okay. I move to recess into executive session for 30 minutes for the purpose of discussing matters pertaining to non-elected city personnel for the reason that public discussion of the matter would violate the privacy rights of the non-elected personnel involved, and reconvene at 7:55 p.m.
Second.
For the motion and a second to adjourn into executive session for personnel reasons for 30 minutes. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carried. We're currently in executive session, and we do not expect any action.